Dark Souls is one of the best series of all time, and has one of the most complex yet remarkable narratives I've ever had the pleasure of uncovering. It's filled with so many ideas, themes, and values that breathe life into this series, and its various interpretations allow people to add in their own details, ultimately making their playthroughs a unique experience. So today I want to take some time to talk about the trilogy. I want to not only retell the game's main stories, but also critique them along the way. I'm going to examine why specific parts of the game are so well crafted and how its world design and bosses shape the story around them. So with that out of the way, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy. Dark Souls 1 is a fantastic game. It's got a wonderful story that would set in motion numerous events that would occur throughout the trilogy, but just within the bounds of its own game, Dark Souls 1 has some incredibly deep and rich lore filled with some of the greatest backstories this series has to offer, and today I want to discuss why. So without further ado, let's get started. So the opening cinematic of Dark Souls 1 starts at the Grey World, one that is filled with giant trees and dragons, and while the world stayed like that for a while, one day fire was born. As for how this fire came to be, well, it's never explained. This is one of the many things we just have to accept. The world of Dark Souls is fantasy, and many things just can't be explained. It's never mentioned how the first flame was created, as it just happened. But because the first flame was born, disparity came with it. Life and death, heat and cold, and light and dark. This description is literal. Since the first flame was created, the people of the world felt its warmth and understood what heat was. When they walked away from the flame, they realized its heat didn't reach them, which created the feeling of cold. The discovery of fire during the Stone Age is to this day the greatest discovery known to man, and in Dark Souls this is no different. Given how unique something like this in the world of Dark Souls was, those who discovered it were obviously attracted to its power. Four notable people would discover Lord Souls next to these flames and be given immense power. These people were Nito, Izalith, Gwyn, and the Pygmy. From the intro, we can infer that there was a civilization of people that existed during the Age of Ancients. Izalith had daughters that were with her when she found her Lord Soul, and Gwyn had his knights with him, implying that people did exist during the time of the Age of Ancients, but weren't of much value to the world given how powerful the dragons were. Eventually, Nito, Izalith, and Gwyn would band together and use their power to overthrow the dragons. Gwyn used his lightning, Izalith used her flames, and Nito used his death and disease. They also received help from a Seath the Scaleless, a dragon who betrayed his own kind. Now that the new lords were on top of the food chain, the Age of Ancients was no more, and the Age of Fire had begun. This period would last thousands of years, until we get to today. Currently, the fire is fading and it needs to be rekindled in order to keep it lit. But doing this is not as simple as it sounds. You may have noticed I forgot to talk about the Pygmy. Well, the Pygmy had a unique soul, called the Dark Soul. Using his soul, he created something called humanity. He would then share this humanity with his people. These Dark Soul-imbued people became known as humans. The Pygmy is essentially our ancestor. Gwyn feared this power though and created the Dark Sign, which inadvertently caused the undead curse. This isn't explained much in Dark Souls 1, but it is by far the most important plot in the whole series. And while I just wanted to talk about this game for the whole video, this needs to be explained or else the rest of the video going forward will make no sense. The undead curse, the Dark Sign, and the fading of the fire are all linked. The Dark Soul gets more powerful the closer the fire is to fading, thus meaning humans should get more powerful over time. But Gwyn screwed humanity twice, by rekindling the flame, thus removing our chance at power, but also by branding humans with the Dark Sign. Think of this as a literal wall of fire that prevents the Dark Soul within men from getting too powerful. The Dark Sign only activates when the flame is fading, because that is when the Dark Soul within men starts to grow stronger. This Dark Sign also prevents humans from dying, but it also causes them to go undead. These fleshy creatures were once undead humans, but they have crossed the barrier of no return. Even though humans are able to revive after death, eventually this will cause them to lose their humanity, lose their minds, and lose their purpose, causing them to go hollow. These creatures are hollows, beings who don't even remember who they are, where they are, or what they're even doing. Gwyn likes being on top, and he fears the day that he will lose his power, so he'll do anything he can to prevent that from happening. He did this by branding humanity with the Dark Sign, but by also rekindling the flame, which is known as the first sin. See, the world is like a set of operations. Things are born, but eventually they'll die. But then more things will be born, only to die soon after. That's just the way the world works. But Gwyn broke the laws of the world by rekindling the first flame. It was meant to be extinguished, but due to Gwyn wanting to hold on to what he held dear, he couldn't dare see it go. He sacrificed himself by using himself as kindling for the first flame. Since he had one of the 4 original Lord Souls that came from the first flame, it was deemed sufficient enough to be used as fuel, and thus the Age of Fire continued. but as we know, it is fading once more. The undead curse is back, humans are turning hollow, and the world is in chaos. Doesn't this sound like a fantastic story? That's because it is. This intro and even the game display a sense of desperation within our characters. How far are people willing to go to get what they want or keep what they have? And while each of their desires is different, it always comes out the same. Dark Souls 1 is just the start, but the actions of its characters will continue to echo throughout the entire trilogy, and we're just getting started. After the opening cinematic, we get to see the state of the world as it is today, or at least the state of this prison. We're an undead that is sitting in their cell awaiting the end of the world. But one day we're given the key to our cell and are able to leave. This person is Oscar, and he speaks of a prophecy.
There is an old saying in my family, "Thou who art undead art chosen, and thine exodus from the undead asylum maketh pilgrimage to the land of ancient lords. When thou ringeth the bell of awakening, the fate of the undead thou shalt know."
This prophecy also happens to be the main objective of the game, but it's only the first part. The rest we'll have to discover later. The intro of Dark Souls 1 sets up a new world by showcasing multiple important events in the world's history, and also gives us enough information to understand the basic premise of the game, while also purposely withholding some of that information to give us a reason to seek out said information. One thing we need to consider though is our character's motivations. Why even bother making the trip to Lordran, the Land of Lords? Well, what else is there to do? It's the end of the world and you were just given the keys to your cell, allowing you to explore the world to your heart's content. Even if you're convinced that life is doomed and the world as we know it will disappear for good, why not make the most out of it? Have some fun, kill some hollows. It's a whole lot better than rotting in a cell. With our objective laid out to us thanks to Oscar, we can now set out to Lordran and ring the bells. Technically the first area you're meant to go is the Undead Burg, but one wrong step and you can make it to New Londo. Out of all the Souls games, Dark Souls 1 will provide the best blind playthrough, as due to its connected world, players will go in different directions, which in turn will create different experiences. New Londo is actually a late game area, since the enemies here are quite strong and the boss at the end of the level is quite tough, but you may stumble upon this area by accident within 5 minutes of arriving. This is due in part to Dark Souls 1's level design, which may have the best level design in the whole franchise. It's been coined as a Metroidvania, a genre that started with the games Metroid and Castlevania. These games have non-linear progression, as many areas can be accessed right away but others can't, causing the player to go around the map looking for the key, then running back to that same location. Such as this door that leads to Havel, which can only be found in the Dark Root Basin past a boss. The door is found pretty early on in your playthrough, but the key is found much later. Plus, you'll also have to remember where that key goes. You'll be doing lots of running in this game. The highlight of one of my play sessions was going from Blighttown to Andre because I forgot to ascend my weapon before a boss fight, meaning I had to take a 3-minute walk up to him, then a 3-minute walk back down. In future titles, this would be remedied by fast travel, but Dark Souls 1 doesn't have fast travel initially, and even when you do gain the power of fast travel via the Lord Vessel, it's not the typical fast travel we're familiar with, as we're only allowed to travel to specific bonfires. These decisions further immerse the player into the world as it's all one connected level, and since they're all connected, that means you can see certain levels from different places, such as Blighttown, which is visible from Firelink Shrine. So not only was the level design of each area taken into account, but also how the levels connected to one another and how this connection would affect other areas. Regardless of where you end up though, whether that be New Londo or Undead Burg, the very first enemies you'll come to see are these hollow men, like the ones back in the asylum. All the undead we see here are humans who have lost their humanity, causing them to go hollow. And now since we are human, we should go hollow too, however it's a bit more meta than that. Hollowing is a bit hard to define as everyone can go hollow for different reasons, but the two main ideas seem to stem from constant death or a loss of purpose. Given that our character is set on ringing the bells, he never goes hollow despite being undead, as he still has a purpose. Should the player quit and uninstall the game, they would lose their purpose, so permanently quitting the game is sort of like hollowing in a sense. I don't think everything needs to be explained with lore, so this is more than likely just a gameplay mechanic, but that's how I've interpreted hollowing. On our way to the Bells of Awakening, we'll come across various different locations, but sadly there isn't a whole lot of backstory involved in their creation. Locations like Undead Burg are just undead settlements, and the Valley of Drakes is just a valley filled with drakes. The only exceptions though are Ash Lake and Blighttown. Blighttown is next to a location called the Depths, and at the end of the Depths is the Gaping Dragon. And while an interesting boss, what's more important is the arena. We can see water coming from the depths and going into the sewer system, which leads to Blighttown. According to various keys in the game, we can piece together that those who previously lived in the Undead Burg but were banished from the settlement were sent to Blighttown as punishment. This is reinforced by the giant door that separates the sewer system from the outside world. But this water from the sewer is poisonous. Well, in Blighttown there's a spell called Poison Mist, and according to its description, it seems that Gingy, this egg-bearing individual, may have caused this as he was the creator of the Poison Mist spell. It's not fully confirmed that he did this, but it's clear that Blighttown isn't in the greatest state. And it's due to the circumstances surrounding Blighttown that the townsfolk seem to have built above the water in hopes of getting away from it. This is a common theme in these games of things being built on top of one another, as we see Blighttown above the swamp, the depths above Blighttown, and the Undead Burg above all that. The idea of pushing things down and leaving them to fester is also a common theme within this game, but not everything is in such a sad state. As at the lowest point of Lordran, we see Ash Lake, a seemingly infinite land filled with arc trees that are surrounded by an equally infinite body of water. For the purposes of Ash Lake, this seems to be where the dragons used to live, or at least one part of it, as it's eerily similar to the environment in the intro, which we do know was the land of the everlasting dragons. We can even find one of the few remaining dragons down here in Ash Lake. He's a part of the Dragon Covenant in-game, and from various descriptions, it seems like many people worship the dragons and tried to ascend to their level. It's unclear though if that worked. Once the player feels confident in their fighting abilities, they can approach the bosses defending the Bells of Awakening, these being the Bell Gargoyles and Chaos Witch Quelaag. After ringing both bells, we'll see that Sen's Fortress, a place that was originally blocked with a large gate, is now open. But if we travel back to Firelink Shrine, we'll find a primordial serpent named Frampt. He claims to be a close friend of Gwyn's, and also claims to know our fate.
Very well. Then I am pleased to share. Chosen Undead, your fate is to succeed the great Lord Gwyn, so that you may link the fire, cast away the dark, and undo the curse of the undead. To this end, you must visit Anor Londo and acquire the Lord Vessel.
Just like before, this second part of the prophecy also happens to be our newest objective, but Frampt is quite a complex character. If certain conditions are met within the game, we can also be granted an audience with Koth. He, however, tells us a different story.
Your ancestor claimed the dark soul and waited for fire to subside, and soon the flames did fade, and only dark remained. Thus began the Age of Men, the Age of Dark.
So it wasn't just the fact that the fire was fading that caused Gwyn to rekindle it, the flame actually went out. Furthermore, despite being the same species, both Frampt and Koth have different views on the world. Frampt wants to keep the Age of Fire going, but Koth wants to usher in an Age of Darkness. The question is, who do we trust? Well, that's up to you, as these are the two endings of the game. Extinguish the flame or rekindle it. The choice is yours. What is important to note though is their motivations. Why are they doing this? Why are they against each other? Well, we still don't know, and it's been a widely debated topic that hasn't been given a proper answer yet. Regardless, I don't think you should trust any of them. Frampt claims that the undead curse will be cured if we link the flame, but this isn't correct. As we'll see in Dark Souls 2 and 3, the curse is still present. Frampt and Koth are like politicians. They say what needs to be said, but never elaborate. By technicality, the undead curse will be cured when we link the flame. As we know, the dark sign only appears when fire fades. And if it's not fading, then the curse of the dark sign is gone, which means the curse goes with it. But it will eventually come back. Things are meant to run their course, so over time the fire will fade again and the curse will come back, just not in our character's lifetime. Frampt, whether intentional or not, is leading the player to believe that the curse will disappear permanently, when indeed it only just disappears for a few thousand years. But Koth is also lying, as he isn't fully explaining what this Age of Darkness entails, and as we'll see, Koth isn't exactly the nicest person in the Souls universe. I've always seen these two as immortal beings, ones that are ageless, and due to this, when the time comes, they like to move the pieces a bit and see what happens. Koth and Frampt are basically playing a long game of chess, but without the stakes. Regardless of who wins, they both continue to live. One just managed to convince the chosen undead more, so why not cause a bit of chaos? A lie or two here wouldn't hurt anybody, as it's just extra pieces on the board to them. To this day, we still don't know what they really want from us and whether their goals they conveyed to us were actually genuine. My interpretation of these could be wildly incorrect, but that's the beauty of these games. They allow you to shape your own story and create your own adventure, and in my story, I don't trust these two. Regardless of who you believe, the one thing they agree on is that we need the Lord Vessel, thus we need to get to Anor Londo. To get there, we'll need to pass through Sen's Fortress, a place filled with deadly traps and is easily the most infuriating area in the whole game. The fortress is also used as a sort of trial, as this leads us to Anor Londo, but many people have tried and failed to get there. This is of course due to the numerous traps throughout the fortress and the Iron Golem at the top, although he was surprisingly the easiest part of the fortress. Once the Golem is defeated, we are then grabbed by these demons and taken to Anor Londo. It's hard to forget your first time in Anor Londo. Nothing up until this point has been more extravagant and beautiful looking than this place, and that's what makes it so memorable. In a world devoid of beauty and color, there's this incredible place that just exists, but it's on the other side of the wall. But something is off. It feels empty, like we showed up late to a party, and in a more metaphorical and literal sense, we have. This place is gorgeous, but if you'll excuse the pun, it's also quite hollow. Lots of your time in Anor Londo is spent walking, but if you manage to make it past these giants and exploit the AI of these Silver Knights, then you'll make it to the climactic fight of Ornstein and Smough. ONS is undoubtedly my favorite fight in Dark Souls 1. The balance of these two is unmatched, as Ornstein is a quick, nimble fighter that can go halfway across the arena just to hit you, but his damage is nowhere near as staggering as the force that is Smough. Whereas Ornstein instills fear from his speed, Smough's fear comes from his power. Ornstein at the beginning of the fight is more or less a pushover. He does deal decent damage, but it's not enough to warrant a healing item. But no amount of damage resistance, especially this early on, could protect you from Smough's hammer, and one hit from this hammer can make Ornstein seem a lot more threatening. Their power grows from the other's presence, as the more Ornstein chips at your health, the closer you are to being within one-shot range of Smough, and if Smough hits you once, well, there's nothing that can compare to that level of stress. They feed off each other in such a balanced way. In fact, they actually feed on each other, as whoever falls first becomes the power source for the other. Their health also goes back to full, so it's never about dwindling them down over time, it's committing to one and sticking with it. The problem is knowing when to strike and how. Given how well they complement each other, it might seem like there's never an opening, and that's what makes them such a difficult fight. All that's required though from the player is patience. It's arguably one of the best fights in the game, and even the series as a whole, and I can finally see why. While ONS may seem like the climactic finish to the level, hold your load, as behind them is the real climax, the Princess of Sunlight, Guinevere. Feel free to interpret climax however you want. She is the one who gives us the Lord Vessel we need to progress through the game, but as I said earlier, it feels like we arrived late to a party. Well, I wasn't lying. Once the post-nut clarity settles in, if we attack Guinevere, the world of Anor Londo shows its true colors, and reveals that it's just as depressing as everything else in Lordran, and the one responsible for this illusion is Darksong Gwyndolin. Gwyndolin is an interesting case to me, as he was the last-born child of Gwyn, who was a male but was raised as a female. This was due to his strong affinity with moon magic. I'm not sure what the connection is, but maybe it's some sort of cultural thing where the moon is seen as a sort of feminine symbol, which would actually explain a lot regarding a future game and two of its characters. Gwyndolin also created the illusion of Anor Londo to seemingly entice the chosen undead to continue their duty. Remember, Gwyndolin only appears when we kill Guinevere's illusion, meaning that this is actually Gwyndolin speaking to us through his sister. He also shares the same viewpoints as Frampt, which is interesting as he's basically telling us to kill his father and continue the Age of Fire. Gwyndolin seems to want to hold on to the power his family has and keep things running smoothly, which is why he wants the Age of Fire to continue so that his family and their powers can stay. And the reason why he created the illusion of Anor Londo was also to desperately hold on to the past. I guess it runs in the family then. As for how Guinevere fits into this, well, she was Gwyn's second-born child, who, like many other deities, left Anor Londo. She would then meet with a flame god Flan and later become his wife. Besides these two, Gwyn had two other children, but we'll have to wait for Dark Souls 3 to discuss more about them. So Anor Londo, the city of gods, this place that was supposed to be seen as a beacon of hope to all within Lordran, is just an illusion. But Anor Londo isn't the only illusion of Lordran. By making our way to the painting inside this city, upon touching it, we're thrown into the painted painted world of Ariamis. Ariamis as a concept is fascinating, as it's this world within a world, and these people inside the painting could possibly never know of the world outside of it. From exploring this hidden world, we learn that Ariamis was made for things the gods feared. Ariamis is home to the followers of Velka, and Velka is known as the goddess of sin. Furthermore, this is the only location in the game where you can find the Dark Ember, which according to its item description is used to make occult weaponry, weapons that were favorable amongst those who planned to kill the gods and their kin. Velka was more than likely someone who wanted to hunt the gods but was killed or thrown into the painting. It's clear that this place has a malicious history behind it, but it's not all bad, as the person who watches over Ariamis is crossbreed Priscilla. Priscilla is a half-human, half-dragon crossbreed. Due to this unique birth, she also gains some unique abilities, mainly the ability of Life Hunt, which she uses on her scythe. These powers of hers could threaten the gods' rule, so they also threw her into the painted world. But what's rather interesting is Priscilla herself. She's the only boss in the game that doesn't want to fight us. She even tells us how to leave Ariamis, meaning not only does she have no intent of enacting revenge, but she knows how to leave yet refuses. Priscilla may have felt how these new arrivals feel, but instead of using vengeance, she uses acceptance, and instead welcomes these people into her painted world. It's actually quite wholesome, and is the reason why I couldn't kill her. Every boss in this game is hellbent on killing me, so when I finally discovered one that didn't want to, and in fact helped me, I couldn't refuse. So I left, with the hope that Priscilla would be able to make this place a proper home for her people. This whole area is swarming with hollows and other creatures that want nothing more than to kill us, but they were either tricked into here or thrown in because the gods willed it. And yeah, some of them probably do belong in here, but if Priscilla is set on making this place a home for those who have found themselves here, then who am I to intervene? After acquiring the Lord Vessel, when we meet with Koth or Frampt, they'll tell us that to gain access to Gwyn, we must gather the remaining Lord Souls and use them to satiate the Lord Vessel. These Lord Souls belong to 4 individuals: Seat the Scaleless, the Witch of Izalith, Nito, and the 4 Kings, 3 of whom you will have already recognized. From here, we can tackle the game in any order we want, so let's start with the 4 Kings. The 4 Kings are, well, 4 kings who ruled over New Londo. They were given fragments of Gwyn's soul, which is why we need to kill them. You may recognize their boss location, as this is the same dark abyss that we met Koth in. Well, long ago, the 4 kings were tricked by Koth and were consumed by the abyss. This caused the kings to go mad, and this also caused the citizens to either become these blobs of mass or the Dark Wraith soldiers. This area really utilizes the environment to tell its tale, as this place is overrun by the ghosts of the villagers, and when we actually unlock the door to lower New Londo, we see piles of corpses scattered throughout the land. Koth single-handedly destroyed an entire city simply by tricking its inhabitants and unleashing the abyss upon them. While the mass extinction of a city sounds bad, there is still more destruction to be seen. One thing you may have noticed is a severe lack of human bosses. Quelaag would probably count as the first one you'd meet, although she's sort of half-human, but there's a reason for this, as this has to do with the Witch of Izalith. While Gwyn was frantically running around trying to figure out what to do with the flame, the Witch of Izalith had a plan. She was going to create a new flame that would replace the first flame, but she attempted to create a replica in the presence of the very thing that was created, which brought with it massive consequences. The Witch of Izalith wanted to create a new first flame, but there was already a first flame present in the world. There can't be 2 first flames. Due to this, the flame that she created couldn't be contained for long, causing it to erupt, and this not only consumed her and her children, but also created new life, as it gave birth to demons. The Asylum, Taurus, and Capra Demon, roughly the first 3 bosses in the game, were created from this event. In fact, anything that has the word demon in it is most likely derived from this flame of chaos. But not only was new life created, old life was altered. All of Izalith's family who were caught in the explosion were all transformed into demons themselves. Chaos Witch Quelaag, the Fair Lady, and Ceaseless Discharge are 3 of Izalith's children. Just as Gwyn was desperate to continue the Age of Fire in an attempt to keep what he had, so too did Izalith, but the consequences are a reflection of her actions. In an attempt to give life to something bright and warm, she ended up giving life to something cold and dark. She also wanted to extend the Age of Fire in order to continue her prosperous life with her children, but by doing so, she ended up making their lives a living hell. Not a single person in this family tree is living a robust life anymore. Quelaag and her sister the Fair Lady are half demon and are more than likely suffering from their condition, as told to us by the Fair Lady.
Quelaag, what is it? Quelaag, my dear sister, the eggs, it hurts. They've gone still. I am afraid it may be too late. I am so sorry, dear sister.
Ceaseless Discharge was covered in lava source from birth, so his life was a living hell from the start. The Flame of Chaos just made it worse. Ceaseless Discharge, just like Priscilla, doesn't actually want to fight us. It's only until we steal this clothing set that he attacks us. This clothing set rests upon a grave that belonged to his sister Quaylana, who he believes died in the explosion, when in fact she was the only one who escaped. Quaylana will appear in Blighttown if the player is sufficient enough in Pyromancy. Quaylana explains that she was the only one who made it out of the reaches of the Flame of Chaos. In fact, she was actually able to harness the power of the Flame of Chaos and create magic, which we know as Pyromancy. Quaylana wants us to fulfill her duty for her, as she does not have the strength to go on. She instructs us that we need to put down her siblings and her mother so that they may rest in peace. This whole family dynamic is horrific, as Ceaseless believes that all his sisters are dead, even though Quaylana is alive, and Quaylana is only a few meters from her sister, and yet we can't tell her about this. Clearly, this is turning into a very depressing story, but it only gets worse. As we get closer to the final boss of the area, we'll meet with a pyromancer who is assumed to be another daughter of Izalith, although it's unclear why she is so far down in these ruins yet is completely unharmed. It's possible that she, like Quaylana, escaped the Flame of Chaos, but this daughter came back to finish off the boss right behind her, or has possibly gone insane and is now defending said boss. And by going down this slide, we will meet this monstrosity who is the Bed of Chaos. This is the Witch of Izalith. One of the foremost powerful people in the world has been demoted to this deformed tree-like creature. There are also these orbs next to her that we need to destroy in order to damage her, and it's assumed by many that these are her other two daughters that were closest to her when the flame erupted. So we have two daughters stuck to their mother, two daughters who were half afflicted by the flame, a son who is arguably the most affected, and two daughters who managed to survive. One who doesn't have the strength to carry on anymore, and another who sits outside her mother's arena. This is by far the most depressing story I've ever had the misfortune of uncovering. The further we push into Lost Izalith, the more of the family we get to meet, allowing us to see the consequences of her actions. We can see the pain that all of them are in, as some of them are just wishing for their siblings back, and others just want to stay alive. It's an awful story that all leads to the final fight with Izalith herself, and it is by far the most anticlimactic ending I've ever experienced. It is agreed upon by many that the Bed of Chaos is the worst fight in Dark Souls 1. The boss is insanely difficult, but it's not the difficulty itself that's the issue, it's why the boss is difficult. I would argue that just within the main game, the two hardest bosses are the Four Kings and Ornstein and Smo. O and S are difficult bosses because there's two of them. You have to have both on screen at all times or you'll lose this fight. This is balanced by having Ornstein be fast but not as lethal, and Smo being slow and hard hitting. It's a wonderful dichotomy that makes for a satisfying fight. And the Four Kings is a DPS check, as every 30 to 45 seconds a second king will spawn, and this will keep going until 4 on your screen at once. To succeed, you need to kill the current king before this happens. Both boss fights are hard but have weaknesses you can exploit. The Bed of Chaos has none. To defeat the boss, you need to destroy both orbs on her sides, then go down the middle inside of her so you can find the source of her power. She's actually extremely weak, as both the orbs and her die in one hit. It's getting there that's the issue. Her hand attack is oddly timed, and due to her design, it's unclear where her hitbox ends. After defeating one of the orbs, the floor will start to crumble, so not only do you need to avoid her attacks, but you'll also need to avoid the floor. There's also a strict path you're meant to follow for this fight, which will lead you right next to a broken piece in the flooring, so you'll more than likely get hit and fall in and die. The walk back to this boss is also just as atrocious, as you'll more than likely spend more time walking to the boss than actually fighting her. Thankfully, there is no reset involved in this boss, as every single run you've done is carried over to the next, as it essentially has unlimited checkpoints. It's like From Software knew it was bad, but still kept it in. Even if I actually enjoyed the fight, the payoff narratively isn't worth the time. We ventured further and further into the depths of Lost Izalith, coming across all of her children who were these hideous beasts that did incredible damage, and she's just a puzzle. The Witch of Izalith has one of the best backstories in the game, as the tale of her children is heartbreaking, and being able to see their conditions face to face does take a lot out of you, but it's completely soured by a boss fight that is mechanically and narratively a letdown. Our third Lord Soul belongs to Grave Lord Nito, and he's interesting, to say the least. Nito might have the most detailed boss design, but the most basic story out of all the four lords. If you were to just assume that Nito simply became the Grim Reaper and just administered death, you wouldn't be far off, which is a shame for someone of his importance. Gravelord Nito lives in the Tomb of Giants, which is accessed via the catacombs. Both of these areas share a similar theme of death, as this is where the dead are buried. So we know that he administers death, but what else does he do? Well, not much else. He does have a covenant that you can join, but their goal is just to spread more death across the world. It seems like he doesn't care about what's going on in the world, as the only reason he attacks you is because we're obviously here with malicious intent. Nito doesn't have any lore regarding his life during the Age of Fire, and it's just about him administering death. From this we can infer that Nito either doesn't care about the Age of Fire, or maybe even just wants the Age of Darkness to occur. The only other bit of lore surrounding him is a boss named Pinwheel, who is a necromancer, presumably made up of 3 people, as referenced by the number of masks on the body, who stole an item from him known as the Rite of Kindling. There are quite a few theories regarding Pinwheel, like the fact that Pinwheel was originally a father, but his wife and child died, so he attempted to resurrect them, but it failed, and some have stated further that he's still trying to figure out how to revive them, as we can see skeletons throughout the room which could be seen as his test subjects. But other than that, we've pretty much discussed all of Nito. There isn't anything else to speak about, which is a real shame. His backstory has a massive amount of potential, but it just felt unfinished. There are no major themes tied to Nito. He just kinda exists. Our final Lord Soul belongs to Seath the Scaleless. Seath, as we remember, allied himself with our 4 lords and attacked the dragons. The reason he did this was because Seath, unlike the other dragons, was not immortal. All the other dragons had impenetrable scales that could not be broken with any type of weapon. Seath was not born with these scales, so in a sense he was not immortal. It was only until Gwyn was given their weakness from Seath, which we know is lightning, that Gwyn was able to pierce the dragon's scales and actually kill them. Seath was envious of his brethren, as they had what he didn't, so as thanks for working with Gwyn, he was named the Duke and given the Duke's archives, as well as some of Gwyn's Lord Soul for power. During the war, Seath found the Primordial Crystal, an item that gave him temporary immortality. But during this time in the Duke's archives, he eventually went mad with his experiments and his research. He is considered the grandfather of sorcery, as well as the creator of these creatures and the Moonlight Butterfly. Our first interaction with Seath is that he ends up killing us and throwing us in a prison cell. We can see that theme of desperation, as Seath is trying everything he can to get what he wants, but in the process it made him mad. He's not as mindful of his actions as he used to be, and is sort of a shadow of his former self. One thing I find interesting in this prison is the abundance of miracle-related items, and the clothing that are scattered throughout the prison. It's possible that clerics were deemed suitable subjects for Seath experiments. Maybe this is due to their magical power, or because they were so easy to defeat. To kill Seath though, we need to head to the Crystal Caves, which I was originally going to say was probably the worst level in this game due to half the map being invisible, but the walk to the boss is surprisingly straightforward. Venturing off that path though is where the problem lies. To defeat Seath, we need to break his primordial crystal so that we can sever his immortality, giving us a chance to kill him. The story of these lords caused a bit of an imbalance throughout my playthrough. You can go through Lost Izalith and the Demon Ruins, which is filled with rich lore, tons of backstory, and compelling bosses that fit with the lore surrounding the Witch of Izalith, but then you go to the Four Kings and just find out that they were lords of New Londo who got tricked by Koth and consumed by the Abyss. It feels jarring going from one to the other, as one feels thorough while the other feels incomplete, like you missed something or there was more that should have been said. I don't think every boss needs to have a multi-page Wikipedia article in order for it to be considered a good story. I think that the boss's story said what needed to be said in regards to the overarching plot, but I can't lie to you and tell you that I didn't leave these locations wanting more. I wanted to know more about the Four Kings and how they rose to power, and I wanted to know more about Nito and Seath in general, but I never got that. And I guess in a way, this could be viewed as a positive, as I didn't walk out of these places not wanting to learn them at all, but rather wanted to learn more. The game invested me so much into its story thanks to its characters and environmental storytelling that I wanted the game to provide me with more information on it. I wanted to be encapsulated by this story more than I already was. As with many Souls games, not all answers are explicitly told to us, but there was still a lot of burning questions I had that never got mentioned. With the Lord Souls in the vessel, we are now able to fight Gwyn, but we still have one final location we need to visit, which is the Land of Ulasil, accessed via the Artorias of the Abyss DLC, the one and only DLC that Dark Souls 1 would have. We start this DLC by defeating this gold golem that has a woman named Dusk captured inside. Dusk was the princess of a place called Ulasil. According to her, it's a place from an age that existed long ago. Hilariously enough, she doesn't actually say anything after this. You would think that the DLC would sort of spin a story that her home is in danger and we need to save her, but she doesn't actually tell us that. She just sells us sorceries. The DLC doesn't officially start though until we return back to her location with an item called the Broken Pendant, which causes us to get sucked into this portal and taken to Ulasil. As Dusk said, Ulasil is a place from long ago, and while you may be confused on how this fits within the geography of Lordran, this place is a lot closer than you think. In fact, we already ran through it to get to the DLC. The Darkroot Garden is Ulasil. This is evident by the tree enemies who have a similar design to these tree-like enemies, and the same plants that are only found in the Darkroot Garden are also found here as well. Ulasil was a city hundreds of years before the Darkroot Garden came to be, so something happened that made this place turn into the garden that we know of. Well, to understand the story of Ulasil, we need to talk to Elizabeth.
But Princess Dusk is here no longer. snatched away by that horrifying primeval human. And so I must ask, couldst thou once more play the saviour? An abyss was begat of the ancient beast, and threatens to swallow the whole of Ulasil. Knight Artorius came to stop this, but such a hero has nary a murmur of dark. Without doubt he will be swallowed by the abyss, overcome by its utter blackness. Indeed, the abyss may be unstoppable. Still, I have faith that Princess Dusk may be rescued yet.
This prime evil human is Manus of the Abyss, the final boss of the DLC and the thing that sucked us into Ulasil in the first place. So our job is to hunt Manus down. My main gripe with the DLC is justification, as technically with the Lord Vessel we can just leave, so why do we need to worry about this? It's not an immersion-breaking problem, but it is a shame. While traveling to the land of Ulasil, you will come across this Colosseum-like structure, which is where we get to meet our next boss, Artorius of the Abyss. Artorius was one of the 4 Knights of Gwyn. The other 3 are Hawkeye Goth, who is sitting at the top of the tower right next to the Colosseum, Kayrin, who appears in the Colosseum after we defeat Artorius, and the final knight is Ornstein. Each of them were skilled in their own ways, as Hawkeye used his powerful great bow to shoot down dragons. In fact, he can actually help us shoot down Calamite, who was the last of the ancient dragons. Ornstein also used his spear that was able to cut through the scales of dragons with ease, and we can also see the spoils of his war due to the amount of dragon heads that exist in Anor Londo. Artorius is also able to wield his greatsword with incredible finesse, and Kayrin used her 2 daggers to cut down anyone who opposed Gwyn's rule. But all of them, minus Ornstein, are way past their prime, which is a growing theme amongst the entire series. Goth was imprisoned in this tower with nothing left to do but to make carvings. He also couldn't use his great bow anymore, as all the dragons had been wiped out, so he has no purpose. Kayrin may have had a deep love for Artorius, as when we visit her, she is next to a grave she made for him, and asks if we can give her his soul. If we do, she gives us her weapons and continues to sit by the grave, implying that she no longer wants to be a knight anymore. And Artorius came to Ulasil in an attempt to stop the abyss from spreading, but ended up losing and being corrupted himself. His left arm is also dangling, which might suggest that it's broken. This is because he used his shield to protect his wolf companion Sif, the same Sif from the main game, although he is much smaller in this DLC. Sif also has a different intro if you do the DLC first, because Ulasil is in the past, so he'll remember you in the present, and it makes killing him that much harder. In regards to Sif, it's possible that he doesn't want us getting the Covenant of the Abyss ring, as that allows us to travel through the abyss to kill the 4 kings, and given his owner's condition, Sif probably doesn't want us to end up like Artorius. The Artorius boss fight was actually really entertaining. He was the first boss that felt like the antithesis of this game's combat. Most of the game's pace has been very slow and methodical, but he has these fast attacks and very few openers. I do wish though that there was at least an ounce of build up to this fight, as you can literally start the DLC and be at the boss room in about 10 minutes. I think having the player traverse some of the areas that are covered in these abyss creatures that grow in number as we get closer to Artorius would have been great, as it's slowly leading us towards this person responsible for all this death. While narratively it felt a bit too fast for me, the fight mechanically was great. After Artorius, we can explore the rest of Ulasil and we can see how much this land has been affected by the Abyss, as all the inhabitants have been infected by this dark energy, turning them into these disgusting creatures. Eventually, we'll reach the bottom and this feeling of fear starts to set in as the world becomes darker and darker the further we go down. Here in the chasm of the Abyss is where the darkness reaches its peak, and it's where these dark sprites of humanity live. These are very similar in design to the actual humanity we consume in-game. This seems to be humanity in a more physical form, one that is more exposed and not constricted by the dark sign. At the foot of the chasm is our final boss, Manus, the Father of the Abyss. Manus has an interesting story. Apparently the people of Ulasil were tricked by a serpent, who was probably Koth, into digging Manus' grave up. In doing so, it caused Manus to go wild and unleash his wrath upon them. According to his soul, Manus was once a human, but became Father of the Abyss when his humanity went wild, and now he eternally seeks his broken pendant. The same pendant we had to find to start the DLC. It's unclear why he liked this pendant so much, but it was possibly nostalgic to him, or was given to him by someone he loved, and because this pendant was so important to him, he did everything he could to get it back, which inevitably drove him to insanity. It seems that he got so desperate to find the pendant that he pulled in random people into this world, as the NPC Marvelous Chester is clearly not from this world, and he even says so himself. He also kinda looks like the hunters from Bloodborne, which is a nice reference to the game. The main question many within the community have, though, is who was Manus before he became his current deformed state? Well, We really don't know. Many have said it's the furtive pygmy, and I like that idea, but I think it's less interesting than that. Many of the spells in this DLC say that they were created by an Ulyssilian sorcerer on the brink of madness. I can't help but think that this is perfect for Manus' description. One thing that is interesting is that in the middle of the arena is a grave with a humanity-shaped hole, so maybe Manus was one of these humanity sprites when he died, or that this is what he turned into when he died. Regardless, it's a very interesting detail. I also couldn't get any footage of this as she disappears when you leave the boss room, but Dusk apparently appears out of Manus when we kill him, meaning that he kidnapped her. This may confuse some people, as Dusk has been sort of all over the place in this game, and due to her going from the past to the present, it sort of screws with the time a bit. It seems like she was sent into our time somehow and was captured by this golem. She then disappears and goes back into her time, which then leads to the Abyss incident with the people of Ulysil. Artorias is then called to defeat the Abyss, but fails, and then we get summoned into this world via Manus' hand, then save Dusk and go back to the present. It's still a little confusing, and the world of Dark Souls is also very confusing when it comes to time, as always during this fading of the fire, time is very convoluted because we can summon people as phantoms and the time sort of stops. It's very confusing, but that's how I think it went down. But with Manus dead, we have officially finished the DLC. However, this won't be the last time we'll hear of Manus, but that's for Dark Souls 2. Artorias of the Abyss was a great DLC. While it does lack in motivation in regards to the player, the actual story of the DLC was great. It provides us with a nice timeline of events, as well as more insight into the Abyss and its effects on the world, and while not known at the time, it would eventually set up the plot to Dark Souls 2. It is without a doubt a worthy extension to the game's story. But now we can finally go to the kiln of the First Flame and determine the fate of Lordran. The kiln is coated in ash, and we can see the spirits of those who followed Gwyn into the kiln walk around aimlessly. As we approach the First Flame, we have one person in our way, and that is the Lord of Sunlight himself. Earlier I said Gwyn sacrificed himself to rekindle the flame, and he did, but because of his Lord Soul's power, he was able to keep his body, but his mind was gone. Gwyn has gone hollow. And while I'm more than capable of killing him myself, I couldn't dare start the fight without the guy who's been by my side since the very beginning. Solaire of Astora is easily the most well-known NPC in the entire Souls franchise, and his story is a perfect representation of the mood this game is trying to convey. Throughout the whole game, we've been meeting with NPCs of all kinds, some with goals and others without, but none of them have managed to touch my heart in a way that Solaire and Siegmeyer did. Both of them had a goal in mind. One wants to find his sunlight, and the other wants to explore the world, but both are stuck. Siegmeyer always seems to be getting himself caught in some situation, whether that be a locked gate he can't enter or a poison swamp he can't cross, and Solaire can't find his sunlight. They both willingly became undead in order to achieve their goals, and it tore me apart to hear that Siegmeyer couldn't see it through. Siegmeyer prides himself on being a knight of Katarina, and that he can handle all of his troubles on his own, but with my help I showed him that he wasn't a worthy knight after all, and that he always needed someone to rescue him. More often than not, in these games, your assistance will lead to their death, so it's either converse with them and enjoy their company, knowing that they will die because of you, or distance yourself from them, knowing that while it hurts, it's better that they get to live another day. NPCs of these games will usually end up achieving a terrible fate, but this sadness makes the few times a happy outcome occurs all the better. Solaire wasn't able to find sunlight of his own. He became depressed and wondered if this journey was really worth taking, conveying the tone of the entire game. Is our journey and our struggle really worth it in the end? Which is why I owed it to him to make it right. It may not be the actual sun, but the First Flame could be considered the sun, so for one final time I summoned Solaire, and we took down Lord Gwyn. Gwyn's theme has such a fitting tune. All these bosses have these intense sounds with loud music, but Gwyn's is such a simple piano. It's not intense, it's almost sad in a way that the most powerful man in the world has been reduced to nothing, and what was supposed to be a glorious fight between two warriors really isn't. It makes it all the more worse when you realize that Gwyn can be parried, and once you nail this timing down, this fight is a cakewalk, further showing how far from grace he has truly fallen. With Gwyn defeated, we can now choose our ending, but we aren't the only one who's able to choose. Since we managed to bring Solaire all the way to the end of the game, he was able to also fight Gwyn in his own world thanks to the convoluted timelines of Dark Souls. And it is canonized that he succeeded and linked the flame in his own world. He became the sunlight he was searching for, and that might be one of the greatest endings in the entire franchise. But while Solaire linked the flame, that doesn't mean we have to. If we choose the Age of Fire, the world continues. We rekindle the flame and use ourselves as kindling to continue this age of fire. If we instead choose to leave, we let the flame extinguish itself. We join the primordial serpents, including Koth and probably Frampt, and usher in an age of dark, one where humanity is at the top and we ourselves are the ruler. At least that's what we think will happen. Like many plots in the Souls series, this is once again left up to interpretation. We only get to see the very beginning of our choice, so anything after is just pure speculation. Who knows what will happen after, and who knows if our choice was really the correct one? That's always been up to the player to decide, but I've always felt that these endings are about comfort. Do we stay comfortable knowing that in the Age of Fire we aren't on top and might be mistreated due to our lack of strength, or do we take the risk and see what the Age of Dark is about? One thing to note though is the circumstances regarding these endings. Fram says that the undead curse will be cured if we go with the Age of Fire, and not even Koth says anything about this when we talk with him about it. So does that mean that we'll stay undead, or at least still have the risk of going hollow in the Age of Dark? Furthermore, the Age of Fire was a time ruled by the gods, and they did what they could to keep it that way, but we killed them. Everyone in Anor Londo that is a god is either dead or gone. Gwendolyn is the only one that canonically lives thanks to Dark Souls 3. So even though an Age of Fire can be seen as the Age of Gods, that might not be true anymore as we took care of most of them. So there is positives and negatives both ways, and that's really been the point. There's never going to be a clear answer. It's just whatever you think is right. As for me, I think an Age of Dark is the proper way to go. As we said in the intro, the world of Dark Souls is like a set of operations. Things come and things go. And the Age of Dark should have followed after the Age of Fire, but due to Gwyn breaking the rules of the world, that didn't happen. So I think in an attempt to set things back on track before further destruction, an Age of Dark is the way to go. Regardless of what happens in this Age of Dark, at the very least things will transition back to the way it was supposed to be. However, that might not be the actual ending. Given the future titles, some have debated on proper endings, and given the status of Dark Souls 3, linking the flame I think is the real ending, and is definitely the most agreed upon, as just about every person in this game will speak about linking the flame. We only hear about the Age of Dark from Koth, who we have to jump through several hoops to just even meet. I can almost guarantee someone has gone throughout the entire game and didn't even know that an Age of Dark was the real option because of how hidden it is, and while it's not my preferred ending, continuing the Age of Fire would set in motion numerous events for us to discover. Dark Souls 1 was a fantastic experience from start to finish, and while the road was a little bumpy sometimes along the way, its story wrapped up wonderfully. It's a game that I recommend you play at least once in your lifetime, as you will never get to experience something like this ever again. But we're just getting started. Dark Souls 2 is a brilliant game. It takes into account the Age of Fire and the Age of Dark, and asks the question, why are there only two options? And then continues this idea by shutting out both ages by making something else the main plot of the story, something that I will explain throughout this video. So without further ado, let's get started. So before we start talking about the story, we need to address the game as a whole. Dark Souls 2 requires a different mindset in order to grasp what the game is trying to tell you. As we saw in Dark Souls 1, the game relied heavily on the cycles of the world to be the main plot. It's all about the Age of Fire and the Age of Dark, and what these cycles mean, how they impact the world, and what age we'll choose when we get to the end. This means it also relies heavily on the world itself. Dark Souls 1 was about our four lords, how they rose to power and what they did with that power, and what the state of the world is because of said power. As such, we play a very insignificant person in regards to the overall world, but Dark Souls 2 isn't like that. It's not about the Age of Fire and the fate of the world. It's about one kingdom and how this one kingdom handled its own cycle. Lordran was important as it was the first kingdom in the Age of Fire, but Drang Lake isn't important at all. It's just one of the hundreds of kingdoms built on the same land, and that's what makes Dark Souls 2 so special. It's the insignificance of this game that makes it so compelling, because it isn't tied down by the world's pantheon. It uses what Dark Souls 1 created as a way to write its own story. This game isn't about the cycles, it's about one small part of the cycles, the undead curse. And the quicker you realize that Dark Souls 2 is reshaping the proverbial mold that is Dark Souls 1, the better this game gets. But to explain why, we need to start playing. Our opening cinematic shows our character collapsing in a rainy forest. The narrator talks about the undead curse and how it will infect your mind, how it has the ability to remove all that you hold dear and all that you remember. With every minute, the curse gets worse and worse, until you go hollow, as that is the fate for all undead. But this narrator speaks of a kingdom called Drang Lake, and how we'll walk towards its gate without ever knowing why. We know why we're here in Drang Lake, as our character is trying to find a cure for the undead curse, so they no longer feel its effects, but they're unsure of why Drang Lake specifically. Just as the mind gravitates towards the smell of food when hungry, the mind of the undead is drawn to souls, and Drang Lake has plenty of them. To get to Drang Lake, we must cross a lake and enter a portal. The scene tries to portray this event as some marvelous spectacle, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. Once we cross this gate, we're never coming back. We'll either be trapped here until we cure the curse, or go hollow. The gate is even surrounded by bright bugs, which are known to comfort the dead, almost like it's luring us to our deaths. So for one final time, we gather our thoughts and jump. On the other side of this portal is the Things Betwixt, a place stuck in limbo that serves as a connection between Drang Lake and the outside world. Like I said, we're stuck here for good. Inside this limbo is a house of women, 3 of whom are firekeepers that are being cared for by their housekeeper, and they're very honest about our arrival.
You're finished. You'll go hollow. Yes, you'll become one of them. Hollows prey upon men, feast upon their souls. This is the fate of the cursed.
We aren't the first undead to walk through their doors, and we won't be the last, and all of them have met the same fate, so what makes us any different? Dark Souls 2 tries to set in this feeling of hopelessness, something that's very consistent throughout the trilogy. No one truly believes we can accomplish our goal, but that's what makes the Emerald Herald so wonderful. She believes that we can succeed in our goal and will help us in any way that she can, and by providing us the means to level up, she might be the most helpful person in the game. This is why the level up ladies of the franchise have always been seen in such a positive light. They don't discriminate, and they don't bother questioning if what we're doing is working. They have an undying motivation to help us succeed, regardless of if there's something to gain from it. They're like a bright light in a dark tunnel, as all around them are people who have given up.
I am Solden. And like you, I lost everything. And now I'm here.
The location they both reside in is Majula, a small town on the outskirts of Drang Lake, and its theme music displays a feeling of peace, a place that is void of death, a place that you can feel comfortable in, and in the world of Dark Souls, a place like that is more than necessary. I've always preferred when the main hubs were seamlessly integrated into the world, something that would be eventually lost with the series going forward, as it makes the world more believable, and in the case of Majula, without it you'd be missing this beautiful scenery. After taking in the view, we can speak to the Emerald Herald, who will reveal our objective.
Seek those whose names are unutterable. The 4 endowed with immense souls.
These 4 beings are known as the 4 Great Ones, the Lost Sinner, the Old Iron King, the Rotten, and the Duke's Dear Freya. Just like before, we have 4 beings that need to be slain in order to continue, and just like Dark Souls 1, how we go about killing them and in what order we want to go in is entirely up to us. But one thing to point out though is that the Emerald Herald isn't a firekeeper, at least she wasn't originally. Her real name is Shanalot, and she was given this name by the dragons. Her purpose was to break the undead curse, but seeing as there is thousands of hollows in Drang Lake, she clearly failed. Her goal now is to just rest at Majula, guiding the undead on their journey to succeed King Vendrick. Before we go though, I want to talk about the NPCs. I think Dark Souls 2 really dropped the ball when it came to these characters. Many of them are extremely forgettable and seem to only be placed in the world so that the player can be given a tangible item rather than an engaging story. Benhart of Jugo is a good example, as he seems like a compelling character that may have a memorable quest, all for it to crumble almost immediately. His whole questline revolves around his family heirloom, the giant teal sword resting on his shoulder, which you may recognize as the Moonlight Greatsword, except this one is a fake. It doesn't have the magical properties of the original, but Benhart believes that with enough strength he can unlock its true power. I would have dropped this quest entirely if it wasn't for the fact that he gives us the sword at the end of it. He provides little to no substance to the world, and this goes for a vast majority of characters we meet. There are over 40 NPCs in this game, and about 90% of them provide the player with a service, and some of their services are either outclassed or completely useless. Lenigrast is the Majula blacksmith, but the player may find Macduff, another blacksmith, except Macduff can do everything Lenigrast can do, but with the added bonus of being able to infuse weapons. And Gavlan is a lonely merchant who only sells 5 items, 4 of which are poison. He also has 3 set locations, so in order to purchase his services, you'll need to go out of your way to find him, and that's if you really want poison equipment. There's just so much clutter, as half these characters could literally just combine into one general goods merchant. Thankfully, it's not all bad. Lucatiel has a wonderful questline as she shows us the horrific reality that is the undead curse. She was a warrior of Mira, but now she barely remembers who she is. By the time we get to the end of her questline, she's practically pleading for us to remember her name, as she may not remember it herself. It's unclear why she came to Drang Lake in the first place, but given that her brother Aslatiel will invade us only a few feet from her final location, it's possible that she was looking for him. But now both of them have succumbed to the curse's affliction, never truly knowing what happened to the other. Thankfully, Lucatiel isn't the only character of note in this game, as the feud between Creighton and Pate and the peaceful conversations with Vengarl were fantastic. Being able to take the role of a detective and truly uncover which one is telling the truth, and then choosing a side before one prevails, was a great investigation. And the fact that a talking head can get me to listen to his life story as he thinks about his past life and how much he despises it, shows me that this game has some wonderful stories that are just waiting to be uncovered. You just have to weed through the dozens of merchants in order to find them. Getting back on track, we're still on the hunt for the 4 Great Ones. Once again, this is similar to Dark Souls 1, but instead of ringing the bells of awakening and then finding the Lord Souls, we just have to find the souls already. If you remember from that video on Dark Souls 1, I said that the bells of awakening section was a bit slow, as not much in terms of plot was happening. It wasn't until we rang them that the story really started to take off. Well, in Dark Souls 2, it's the same unless you look at the bigger picture. Before we get to the 4 Great Ones, there are a lot of other areas we need to go through first. For example, to get to the Lost Sinner, we need to go through Majula, to Hade's Tower of Flame, to No Man's Wharf, through the Lost Bastille, and then to Sinner's Rise where the boss is located. All of these locations will seem pointless, and if you just only do this boss fight, it will continue to feel like that. It isn't until later in the game, when the climax hits, that things start to make sense. No Man's Wharf is a small port town, and its final boss is the Flexile Sentry. The Sentry's job was to take as many undead as they could fit on this boat and send them to the Lost Bastille, which is a prison for the undead. But this isn't the only location to have lore regarding the curse. The Huntsman's Copse was a hunting ground for the Old Iron King's men, who were tasked with killing any undead on sight. But as you would expect, they too also succumbed to the curse. Next to this area is the Undead Purgatory, where a chariot rider continually kills and punishes the undead. It's also possible that these necromancers were purposely stationed here. This may imply that the necromancers were used to resurrect the undead so that they can be repeatedly killed for entertainment. Like I said, this game does not focus on the cycles of the world, it's all about the curse, and this is only discovered once we get further in the game, but in the beginning it may seem a bit overplayed. That's why it's required to have a different mindset going into this game. If you're thinking about the cycles, then this game's lore will be boring and repetitive, but it's actually brilliant once everything comes together, as these early areas are showing how different rulers are reacting to the curse and what their actions are as a result of it. And speaking of rulers, one of them happens to be one of the 4 Great Ones. The Old Iron King resides in the Iron Keep, but to get there we must pass through the Huntsman Copse, which we know is the place the Old Iron King sent his men to hunt the undead. Behind this location is Harvest Valley and Earthen Peak, 2 areas that are coated in poison thanks to one individual, Mytha, the Baneful Queen. Mytha's story is rather tragic. She wasn't originally like this monster we see today. She was a beautiful queen, but her drive to win her beloved's heart back is what drove her to such lengths. Mytha's story, though, does have some complications. She is named both queen and princess in that she loved a prince and sought the king's affection. Her story is very confusing because we don't really understand whether she was a queen and a princess or just one of them, but whoever this person was, it's clear they did not love her, and thus she began using poison as a way to obtain beauty. But this came with its own set of problems, as the poison started turning her into a snake-like monster, and yet while she was sulking around her room day in and day out, trying to win the heart of a man, she unknowingly already succeeded in doing just that. The Covetous Demon was a human who loved Mytha and cherished her no matter what form she took. He tried to showcase his love for her through gluttony, but this too would change him and turn him into the monster we see today. But despite his change in appearance, his love for the queen never wavered. Behind the poisonous swamp of Earthen Peak is the Iron Keep, home of the Old Iron King. The Old Iron King was a lord of very little power, but he would then eventually meet a knight called Sir Elon who trained his soldiers in the art of battle. The Old Iron King would then eventually build his kingdom, but doing so cost him almost all his assets. But one day he discovered an iron-producing miracle. This allowed him to control iron to his heart's content, which led to the Iron Keep, a giant fortress made entirely of iron. He started creating soldiers made entirely of iron, and even a demon of fire called the Smelter Demon. This idea of creating things of free will with only raw materials is also related to the Undead Chariot, which of course was his creation, so he's quite familiar with this craft. Eventually, for whatever reason, Sir Elon would leave the Iron Keep and set out in search of unknown lands. After losing his most trusted knight, the Iron King sought the counsel of a man named Aegil. He was presumably a pyromancer due to his goal of trying to give fire a will of its own. The two worked together to create the aforementioned Smelter Demon, but this would bring disastrous consequences to the keep. The two never considered that by giving something free will, it has the chance to turn on its creator, and the Smelter Demon did just that. With one swing, it obliterated the Iron King and sent him into the lava it was born from. This act also caused the lava to take on a much larger form and crash into the Iron Keep, consuming it in lava as we see now. But while the keep and its soldiers were scrambling to higher ground, something else happened. The Iron King's body came in contact with an old soul, the Old King's soul. To those in the present day, he's known as the One Who Shall Not Be Named. But for us, we know him as Gwyn. When killed, the Old Iron King will drop the Iron King's soul, but it's only on New Game Plus that we uncover the truth, that the Old Iron King has come to possess the very soul that Gwyn possessed all those years ago. But the Old Iron King isn't the only one. Each of our 4 Great Ones has come in contact with a soul that belonged to a notable character from the past game. But not only did it give them strength, it may have also carried with it the emotions of those it belonged to. Both Gwyn and the Old Iron King share a theme of power. Gwyn wanted to keep his godlike power and as such took multiple steps in order to achieve that, like linking the First Flame flame, branding humanity with the dark sign, and tossing things he felt could threaten their rule into the painted world of Ariamis. And while his feelings weren't as fierce as Gwyn's, the old Iron King also desired power. He wanted to ensure a protected and impenetrable kingdom, while also relishing in the power that comes with being a king. So he used his power to create a giant kingdom with skilled knights and dozens of monstrous creatures made from iron, and then displayed his power by tormenting the undead for sport and torturing them endlessly simply because he could. But while the Iron King tortured undead against their will, there was one person whose torture was self-imposed. Located in the Sinner's Rise, underneath the Lost Bastille, is a prisoner who willingly imprisoned themselves for the sins of their past. According to Shalaquar, Majula's resident feline, her sin was that she tried to light the first flame. But the key word is light, implying that it had already gone out. So how would this be considered a sin? If anything, it would be the opposite. Sadly, we never truly know what any of it means. One thing we do know is whose soul she possesses. Before the boss fight starts, a bug crawls into her eye, specifically a chaos bug, the same one from Lost Izalith. She is in possession of the Witch of Izalith's soul. We know that these bugs have mind-controlling capabilities, as evidenced by the bad ending of Solaire's questline, so it's possible that the Lost Sinner intended to let us into her cell until the chaos bug felt threatened. But that still doesn't answer the question regarding her self-imprisonment. Maybe she wanted to keep the chaos bug and in turn her from escaping, as this crazed version of the Lost Sinner could have run rampant and slaughtered dozens of people. Or maybe she's somehow feeling the emotions of Izalith, who probably felt immense guilt for creating the bed of chaos, so maybe this feeling of guilt is being transferred over to the Lost Sinner without her knowing. To this day, it's still a mystery, but a very compelling one at that. The Witch of Izalith had a desire to create life, which is why she wanted to make a new first flame. But she wasn't the only one who had desires. But that being's legacy may have created even more devastation than intended. The Duke's dear Freya is a spider who is in possession of Seath's soul, but Seath's feelings and desires are able to engulf those who come in contact with it. Freya's soul talks about a writhing ruin, and how this ancient thing casts a shadow over the land, and that at some point in its life it came in contact with a solitary insect, but grew its power feasting on the wealth of twisted souls found within the land. If we defeat Freya, we can enter the Lord's private chambers, which houses the Duke of Seldora himself, and a cage that presumably belonged to Freya. The writhing ruin was created from Seath's intense feeling of want. He searched endlessly for a way to be immortal, even when he was plagued by insanity, and it's because of how powerful his desires were that they seemed to linger on past his death. The writhing ruin would go on to possess others in an attempt to obtain something, as he possessed a being that turned Man-Scorpion Tark and his wife into half-human creatures. It has this insatiable urge to achieve something. What that something is will depend on the individual. Seath wanted immortality, and Freya may have just wanted strength or power. Regardless, this writhing ruin will presumably seek something until it doesn't for eternity and ruin many lives in the process. It's obvious by now that there seems to be a parallel between our old cast and our new ones in regards to their feelings and emotions. Whether they received these similar feelings when they came in contact with the old souls, or the souls were attracted to them because of their feelings, is unknown, but our old friends' legacies continue to bring disaster even after their death. But for one of them, that may not be the case. Our final great one is the Rotten. In Majula, there is a giant pit, and assuming you can get down there without dying, you'll arrive at the Grave of Saints, a catacomb that used to be a burial site before it was overrun by rats. I was admittedly a bit confused running through here, as I thought this was some ongoing joke I wasn't aware of, as there's a literal rat talking to me, calling me his servant in the most serious tone possible. It's pretty pointless, and it's best if we ignore it and moved on, but sadly we won't be doing much moving as much as we will be falling. Dark Souls 2 somehow managed to surpass Blighttown in quality by making the gutter a darker version of Blighttown, all while being poisoned thanks to these statues. Just like Blighttown, the lore is quite similar, as these are the citizens of various kingdoms that were tossed away out of sight from the rest of the world. After the gutter is the Black Gulch, the home of the Rotten. The Rotten possesses the soul of Nito, but instead of their emotions being similar, it seems to just be their appearance. Nito was an amalgamation of skeletons, and the Rotten is an amalgamation of dead bodies. But whereas Nito was hellbent on administering death throughout the world, the Rotten seems to sort of embrace or comfort it. These statues might possibly be the people who have died down here in the pits. He might be trying to comfort these hollows in their new life, and these statues seem to be a showcasing of his feelings towards his new community. What is rather odd though is that these statues in the boss room don't shoot poison at us, so it's possible that they weren't meant to shoot poison originally, and it's because of this poisonous rot that has taken over the pits that they're allowed to do so. Through our discussion about the Great Ones, you obviously noticed the connections between our old and new cast of characters, but you may have also noticed the lack of lore. There is a lot of information that is either completely unclear or only given some amount of weight thanks to the abundance of theories from the community. Dark Souls 2 is both the most understood and most confusing game within the trilogy, it just depends on what answers you're looking for. However, I feel like I'm content with this. One thing that bothered me about Dark Souls 1, as we discussed before, is that I left some of these boss arenas with more questions than answers. I I wanted to know who the 4 kings of New Londo were and how they rose to power. I also wanted to know more about Nito and his role in the world after the war with the dragons, and while I definitely have similar questions regarding some of our great ones, I left majority of these areas feeling complete. Like I had learned what needed to be learned and I uncovered the real story. And that's the benefit of creating something like Dark Souls 2. We don't really need to know what these great ones did and how they shaped the fate of the world, because they didn't. Despite how important many of the characters in this game may seem, at the end of the day they're just another kingdom in a long line of other kingdoms. No one is going to remember them and no one is going to care about them. That is why I feel satisfied when leaving the Black Gulch or Sinner's Rise. I've uncovered enough lore to get a generous picture of their life, with a few holes just big enough for me to make some solid theories. With all 4 great ones slain, we can now go to Drangleic Castle. Or can we? This is Aldia, the brother of King Vendrick and the scholar of the First Sin. Aldia's story is very unclear at the moment, but we'll eventually learn more about him later. Once we enter Drangleic Castle, we'll see this phantom by the name of Welliger. He's a sort of lore dump, which admittedly might not be the best way to handle this information, but given the nature of these games, where you can go a whole playthrough without really knowing anything, maybe it's necessary. Regardless, Welliger shares with us some backstory on Drangleic and Vendrick. King Vendrick conquered 4 great ones and built a kingdom upon their very souls. He then met a lady named Nishandra who warned Vendrick of another looming threat. These beings were known as giants. King Vendrick would eventually cross the seas and battle these giants, completely decimating their civilization. As a consolation prize, he took most of them prisoner and ran experiments on them. This is what led to the creation of the golems, these beings we see inside the castle, and with the golems he was able to build Drangleic Castle. Later in the game, we'll acquire this item called the Ashen Mist Heart. This allows us to peer into the memories of some specific beings. Most of these memories are from dead giants we come across in the first level. These all showcase different sections of Drangleic being overrun by giants, and one of them even shows us the location of the giant lord. We see the destruction that they left Drangleic Castle in, and we can also see how outmatched the soldiers really were. Even though they outnumber them 3 or 4 to 1, they're getting decimated at every turn. But somehow they were able to persevere, considering there's no giants in Drangleic. But I think the person responsible for some of this victory is us. These memories operate like Ulusil from Dark Souls 1, where we go back in time to alter the past and then go back to the present. This may tie into a subtle hint very early in the game. The first boss in Dark Souls 2 is the Last Giant, whose boss soul description reads, "The Lord of the Giants, who had brought wreck and ruin to the entire kingdom, was said to have been felled by an unknown warrior. His beaten and broken remains were then dragged beneath the stronghold where he was sealed away." This random giant's soul references the Giant Lord and also describes the exact condition this giant is in, meaning this giant is the Giant Lord, and that must mean the unknown warrior was us. This might explain why he thrashes his arms around trying to break free, as he remembers us and wants revenge. This is the complete backstory of Drangleic, which gives us enough answers to our questions, but simultaneously gives us new questions we want answers to, such as the whereabouts of Nishandra. Well, close to the top of the castle is the queen herself.
The last king of this land, King Vendrick, as he was called. He found the strength to rule his people, and when the undead were born, cursed, he found more strength to face them. But in the end, he never took the true throne. Visit Vendrick. We have no need for 2 rulers.
So Nishandra wants us to find King Vendrick, as she says there is no need for 2 rulers, but she also mentions that King Vendrick never took the throne. She just casually says this statement as if this isn't some huge revelation. Since Gwyn, people have been rekindling the flame, but Vendrick didn't. But that doesn't mean Vendrick wants to bring about an Age of Dark. He doesn't want either. This is even more unheard of, as no one has even attempted to invoke a 3rd solution to the fading of the First Flame. But to learn more, we need to find Vendrick. He resides in the Undead Crypt, but blocking our path is 2 bosses, the Looking Glass Knight and Veldestad the Royal Aegis. Both of these fights were fantastic, both from the actual combat to the design of the bosses. I'm just upset that it took this long for this feeling to finally come to fruition. I rambled for quite a bit about the bosses in Dark Souls 1, like how Ornstein and Smo were fantastic and how I despise the Bed of Chaos, but I haven't found the right time to talk about the bosses in Dark Souls 2, as there really isn't much to say. Most of them were pretty underwhelming for the most part, and this is down to a few factors. One was simply over-leveling. Since Dark Souls 2 has 32 bosses in the main game, it's very easy to miss some. I didn't didn't find the Chariot or Old Dragon's Lair until much later when I revisited those areas, so I was a bit overprepared for the boss fight. Dark Souls 1 had a really great way of gating the player's progression while also guiding them down a path, which in turn made every fight feel like a proper match. It wasn't a one-sided victory for the most part. There were a few exceptions like Gwendolyn and Pinwheel, but they have very low health pools, so it's a bit hard to judge them. The other two reasons are just down to overall enjoyment and the summons. The majority of the bosses in this game not only have summonable NPCs, but multiple at that. I had 2 summons for the Looking Glass Knight, and while the game does attempt to balance this by adding more health, we all know the main strength of the summons is to be an extra body for the boss to hit, which means less attention on us and more time to get free hits in. I will admit this trivialized many fights. The Smelter Demon, the Rotten, and probably a few others were really easy with summons, but that comes to my next issue. To complete some of these NPC questlines we talked about earlier, they need to be summoned for bosses. As someone who's trying to get as much lore as possible in one playthrough, I needed to continue these summons questlines, so while I was gaining more progress with the NPCs, it came at the cost of the quality of the fights. This makes me even more disappointed, as many of these questlines didn't even go anywhere, so they were just completely useless and wasted my time. Some of the boss fights though just sucked regardless. I was pretty disappointed with the Chariot fight, even though it was a cool idea, I just wasn't a big fan of it, and this game's obsession with gang fights is quite insane. The Ruined Sentinels and the Belfry Gargoyles were just not entertaining in the slightest. Ornstein and Smote only worked because of how different they were in regards to their moveset and how the arena was designed, and the Bell Gargoyles were okay for the most part since the second one didn't come until halfway, plus they used different movesets. The Ruined Sentinels were the same enemy, copied 3 times, with 0 obstacles to separate them, minus the 1 platform you start on. And the Belfry Gargoyles got way out of hand with close to 3 or 4 at the same time, in the same arena as the original fight, which is not that large and very open. I did manage to beat them on my own, so I was happy that I won, but only because I knew I'd never have to do that fight again. As for the 4 Great Ones, the Old King was just awful. Even though I had a summon with me, his moves would have been the same regardless, and they were almost too easy to evade. The other 3 were pretty good, but nothing spectacular. They did provide some intense moments, but I did have to summon Lucatiel for 2 of them, so I may have missed some of that spectacle. I will recognize though that this entire section is a very subjective take, as a boss's enjoyment largely depends on the skill of the player and their build. But since this is all about my thoughts on the game, my opinion was that they were pretty underwhelming for the most part. It felt like instead of focusing on fewer bosses with unique engagements, they created more, but at the cost of their depth. Behind the Looking Glass Knight is the Shrine of Amana and the aforementioned Undead Crypt. Each of these places were created specifically for the dead. Both the Milfinito and the Finito watch over these respective places in an attempt to guide the undead to their final destination. Both of these creatures have interesting backstories, as they were created by the Old Dead One, who we know as Nito. Both of them seem to be a reincarnation of Nito's soul, as if he created them, we would have seen them in Dark Souls 1, but maybe they didn't plan that far ahead when making the games. Regardless, it is a nice detail, and finally gives us some actual story regarding Nito, so I was more than happy to listen to it. It also continues to reinforce the Old One's soul descriptions that mention how their souls still hold power over the land, as the power of Nito and his obsession with all things death are still utilized to this day. As for what they specifically do, it seems like the Milfinito enchant or comfort the dead via song, as their singing can be heard throughout the level, and the Finito are grave wardens who watch over the dead. Both of these groups seem to revolve around comforting the dead, so maybe Nito is a lot more like the Rotten than I had initially thought. At the very end of the crypt is Veldestad, and while the boss fight was great, what really piqued my attention was his soul and the items acquired from that soul. Firstly, his soul is a dark purple and black color. This is the same as the DLC bosses from Dark Souls 1. I originally thought that this was made to distinguish the DLC from the main game, but it wasn't until Dark Souls 2 that I realized that the soul shape has actual meaning. This is an image of a normal boss soul in this game. Next is from one of the Great Ones, and the other is of those affected by the darkness. Both Manus and the Royal Aegis have the same soul, meaning they're both affected by the darkness, and that's due in part to him being down here since Vendrick locked himself away in the crypt. Another detail that is interesting about Veldestad here is that his soul can buy miracles, specifically the Sacred Oath miracle, which is used by warriors who once served the god of sun. So it seems like the Royal Aegis belong to the same covenant as Solaire. However, we can see that this miracle has either been warped or is unable to be casted, as he never actually uses this in the fight, and instead buffs himself with dark magic, further showing how dark his soul has become. After the Royal Aegis, we can meet Vendrick, and if you expected some grand entrance, then you're playing the wrong game. Just like Gwyn, the most powerful being in the game's world is reduced to a hollow and mindless state. Vendrick's condition actually seems to be much worse, as Gwyn at least retains some of his combat abilities, but Vendrick can barely swing his sword if you choose to fight him. All is not lost though for our king, as if we return with the Ashen Mistheart, we can peer into his memories and be able to talk with Vendrick prior to his hollowing.
Do you intend to link the fire? Then you must first take the throne. Prove your worth. Find the ancient crowns. Seek adversity, and they will be yours.
Vendrick tells us to seek the crowns. These crowns belong to 3 rulers, and also happen to be our 3 DLC. These DLCs not only provide us with additional lore regarding other kingdoms, but also what caused these kingdoms to collapse. When we finish each DLC, we can gain a crown, and after obtaining said crown, we can talk to Vendrick for more dialogue. Some of the dialogue is relevant later, but a common theme throughout his speeches is the idea that we're given a choice. All throughout Dark Souls 1, we were told to link the flame, and that if we failed, the Age of Dark would arise and that would be the end of the world. But King Vendrick is more than content with you making your own choice. This goes back to what we discussed before. Vendrick didn't want an Age of Fire or an Age of Dark, he just wanted to find a way to break the curse. This also ties into his brother Aldia and some of his dialogue when we meet him again.
All men trust fully the illusion of life. But is this so wrong? A construction, a facade, and yet a world full of warmth and scandals. Young Hollow, are you intent on shattering the yoke, spoiling this wonderful falsehood?
Aldia is definitely the most fascinating character in this game. Like Vendrick, he is completely aware that he is unable to change the world in their current state, so he just observes and sees what happens. Aldia says that the joy of life is warm and splendid, but it's a facade as the undead curse will eventually come back. But because of that warmth that life brings us, are we intent on shattering this illusion we live in and spoiling this false life we have? Or are we content with our lives and embrace the warmth and pleasure that comes with it, knowing full well that it's a lie? Aldia, just like the game, wants you to actually make a choice and not blindly follow what some random person will tell us. Use your own experiences, your own knowledge, and your own beliefs to come to an answer. The way this was crafted was absolutely brilliant, and it shows how impressive the writing of this game truly is. But before we get to the DLC and obtain the crowns, we need to talk about the rest of the content. As to actually get the Ashen Mistheart item, we need to travel to Aldia's Keep and the Dragon Shrine. Both Aldia and Vendrick sought to cure the curse, but had different methods of doing so. Vendrick shunned the undead as he wanted them as far away from the kingdom as possible. That's why he threw them in the undead prison of Lost Bastille. In here are hundreds of undead, including some volatile variants, as these were created by Aldia. Whereas Vendrick shunned the undead, Aldia embraced them as he felt that the key to breaking the curse was within the undead themselves, but he didn't welcome them with open arms, as they were all subjected to his various experiments. But Aldia went even further with these tests, and didn't just focus on the undead, but other species. He even recreated multiple dragons, a race of beings thought to be extinct by now. Despite what their names imply though, both the Guardian Dragon and the Ancient Dragon aren't actually dragons. The Guardian Dragon soul can allow us to purchase the Drakewing Greatsword, which states that the Drakes are likely descendants of ancient dragons. This implies that this is actually a Drake and not a dragon. Furthermore, we know the dragons, especially the original dragons, are gone, as Calamite was the last of the ancient dragons. This is still true, as the ancient dragon in Dark Souls 2 isn't a dragon, as it drops a soul of a giant. This thing used to be a giant and was somehow configured by Aldia through rigorous experiments to look like an ancient dragon. To get the actual ancient dragon soul, we need to use the Ashen Mistheart again, but this time in Freya's boss arena, as it allows us to see the memories of the dead dragon hanging from the ceiling. This memory seems to show the original resting place of this dragon before it somehow made it down here. There's not a whole lot to learn from this place other than the fact that these large broken structures look similar to the ones outside Aldia's Keep, and there's only one place in the world that we know that has giant structures like this. It is my belief that this is Ash Lake. It might not be the entirety of Ash Lake, as we don't really know how far these trees went, but it seems to be at least some part of it. In regards to time, this is most likely during the war between Gwyn and the dragons. Ash Lake existed back then, but it wasn't the Ash Lake that we're familiar with, as if you remember, it was all gray before fire was born. So the memory was during the war with the ancient dragons, and the present-day location of Aldia's Keep is where some part of Ash Lake used to be. With all the areas covered, we can head to the DLC, and it's advised to finish all the bosses and content you missed before going, which is why I retraced my steps and discovered the locations of the Dark Lurker and the Old Dragon Slayer. I didn't really find their stories that interesting, but I figured I would cover them before we continue. The Old Dragon Slayer seems to be someone who was was using Ornstein's armor as a way to uphold his legacy, as not only does Ornstein have other plans, which we'll learn about in Dark Souls 3, some have claimed that this is a fragment of Ornstein's old soul that now possesses the armor, which would connect with the running theme of old souls from the past games coming to the present, just like with the 4 Great Ones. As for the Dark Lurker, there's pretty much nothing we know about this being at all. Their soul states that they're a remnant of some ancient dissipated being, and the color of their soul is not dark, implying that they weren't born or consumed by the Abyss, like the Royal Aegis or Manus. They also look very similar to these beings in the Undead Crypt that spawn when the bells are rung. Given the color of the Dark Lurker's soul, it's possible that this being was actually here to fight against the Abyss, similar to Artorias, but there is very little evidence to support this theory. But now we can officially start the DLC. Dark Souls 2 eventually released with 3 additional pieces of content: the Crown of the Sunken King, the Crown of the Old Iron King, and the Crown of the Ivory King. Given the disjointed nature of these DLCs, they could be played in any order as they don't contradict one another, but we'll just go in the order of release. The Crown of the Sunken King starts near the shrine beside the Rotten's boss room, and entering the shrine will take us to Shulva, the Sanctum City. Upon entering, we are greeted by not only a gorgeous view of the underground city, but also a dragon with a giant spear through its chest. This dragon is Sin. Long ago, a race of people found Sin sleeping in these caves, and because they had most likely never seen a dragon before, they worshipped him as a god. These people ended up building a city around the dragon, with the rulers of the kingdom being the Sunken King and his queen Alana. But something happened. A leader by the name of Sir Jorg found the underground city and mounted a siege against its inhabitants, with the intention of slaying the dragon they were guarding. Sir Jorg and his knights believed that killing dragons was a way to obtain a true understanding of life, so they hunted it down. After making it past all their defenses, Sir Jorg was face to face with Sin himself, and that giant spear in his chest was from him. But clearly, Sin lived this wound, and that's because upon awakening from his slumber, he released a giant cloud of poison that coated the entire city. That may also explain why the Black Gulch is covered in this poisonous green liquid, since it's right next to the city, but there's no way to confirm. Before we fight Sin though, we have to fight Alana, so somehow, despite the poison and the attack from Sir Jorg, she managed to live. Well, this might be due to her true form. According to her boss soul and weapon, we can piece together that when the Abyss dissipated, it was broken into fragments, and eventually these fragments came to create a life, meaning that Alana is the daughter of Manus. The reason the Abyss was broken was that the chosen undead defeated Manus back in Dark Souls 1, and since he was called the father of the Abyss, that would make Alana his daughter. Clearly, she poses a threat to more than just Shulva, so we need to put her down. After her death is when we gain access to Sin. As a final fight, Sin wasn't too bad. He has a unique mechanic where the poison from his breath can break the durability of your weapon, which could possibly kill the entire run if you're not careful. The only issue is that this seems to do an insane amount of durability damage, as my bandit axe with only 50 durability was destroyed in a few hits. I'm not entirely sure if 50 is on the low end of durability, but going through all the weapons I picked up across my whole playthrough, they were all between 40 and 70, so if anything I should be right in the middle. This wouldn't have been that bad though if Sin didn't act like the Guardian Dragon and just stayed put for more than a few seconds. I think you can see from the gameplay the amount of chances I have to actually hit this thing are extremely low. I think what makes Shulva so engrossing is the location. How do you possibly build a giant civilization underground, and for what reason? That's at least what I was thinking when going into the DLC. And while I got my answer, I wasn't entirely satisfied with it. One reason why is down to dialogue, as there was no NPCs in this DLC to talk or converse with. We can't gain any new information, as all the people that could have been NPCs are now just walking corpses. Given that Sin poisoned the whole city, I wonder if adding one NPC at the very beginning of the level who's the only survivor of the attack would have been a better idea, as they could have provided the player with additional information surrounding the city, such as why they worship the dragon or how they managed to build all these structures, because in its current state it feels a bit unfinished. The Crown of the Old Iron King is our second DLC and is of course based around the Old Iron King from the main game. This DLC takes place in one of the largest towers he erected called the Broom Tower. To find the crown we need to traverse the entire tower all the way down to the bottom, which was incredibly tedious. There were a lot of traps and enemies that can be very annoying to deal with, but given that the DLC seemed to want to spike up the difficulty, these additions kind of made sense. This tediousness also added to the realism of the level, as it takes quite a long time to scale this entire tower, which is logical given its size. And the tower itself isn't just empty space, as all the space is being used for some sort of purpose, whether it's the smaller guys carrying these giant barrels or the vast amount of machinery within the tower that was made to produce iron. It also fits in well with the theme of the Old Iron King's obsession with iron and how he gained a lot of power from his production of iron. This DLC, however, adopts the same storytelling as the Sunken King, in that there are no NPCs to talk to throughout the entirety of its runtime. But what makes the Broom Tower different from Shulva is that we already have numerous levels and items filled with lore about the Iron King. Shulva was a completely new area with zero reference to the main story, which is why I enjoyed it a bit less regarding the NPC interaction than the Broom Tower. Even though the first boss is technically another smelter demon, the real first boss is actually the Fume Knight. I have zero issues regarding this fight. I actually thought it was perfect. I've stated this many times before, but I prefer the fast combat of the future FromSoft games as opposed to the slower, more methodical nature of the early Souls games. It's not that one is objectively better than the other, it's just a personal preference of mine, and just like with Artorias and Manus, the Fume Knight is another boss that is slowly ramping up the speed of its attacks. They aren't incredibly fast, especially by modern Souls game standards where a 10-hit combo can be finished within mere seconds, but the Fume Knight is definitely a far more faster paced fight compared to the rest of the game. And this even continues with the other boss in this DLC, which is Sir Elon. It's just like the other boss fights of this game where you have to look at your health, stamina, and both your and the boss's positioning all at the same time and then calculate what to do given the parameters, except much faster. I understand this is not everyone's cup of tea, but it's most definitely mine. And even better, the Fume Knight has actual ties to a previous character from the main game. King Vendrick had two trusted knights who he considered his left and right arm. One was Veldestat and the other was the Fume Knight. However, the two clashed, which led to the Fume Knight's defeat. What's interesting is that if you defeat the Royal Aegis, purchase his helmet, and then wear it during the fight, the Fume Knight will start his second phase almost immediately, showing that he still has a grudge against him. As for the Fume Knight himself, he wandered the land in search of power and eventually came across the Broom Tower and met Nadalia, the Bride of Ash. Nadalia would have been the queen of the Old Iron King, but she arrived at the keep after he died. She fell into a deep despair because of this and ended up separating her soul across the Broom Tower inside these ashen idols, which caused the tower to be covered in this thick black fog. This fog has the power to control those who wish to serve her and kill those who refused. When the Fume Knight arrived, instead of destroying the fog like he could have done, he actually just opted to be consumed by it, which is why he sits at the bottom of Broom Tower defending the remains of Nadalia. Since she has the ability to create this black fog and her soul is colored in darkness, it is once again safe to assume that she is another daughter of Manus. If you're noticing a theme here, then you're catching on to the point of these DLCs. Each one of them is centered around a kingdom that a daughter of Manus inhabited. And this goes for our final DLC. But before we leave the Broom Tower, there's a secret room we can discover with Sir Elon's armor, and by using the Ashen Mist Heart, we can go back in time to when he was stationed at the tower. This leads to the boss fight we discussed earlier, but it's a memory, and if we take what we know about the memories and apply it here, we can discover even more lore about Sir Elon. If we assume that the unknown warrior that bested the Giant Lord is us since we went back in time, then we're also responsible for killing Sir Elon. So that statement I said earlier about Sir Elon leaving to search for new lands was possibly a lie, as it may have been told by the Old Iron King so that his soldiers don't uncover his true fate, which makes things a lot more sinister than they seemed. Our third and final DLC is the Crown of the Ivory King. The Ivory King was the ruler of the kingdom Eleum Lois. Upon entering, we can see that it is covered in snow, and given that there isn't any snow in Drang Lake, we must be pretty far from the original kingdom. As we approach, though, we are told to leave. This voice tells us that the old chaos still hungers and that we are forbidden from entering. Clearly, we're not going to listen and charge headfirst through the front gate. Eventually, we'll meet with the first boss of the DLC, Ava. This is one of 7 pets that the Ivory King kept in his kingdom. Each one seemed to have a specific role in the kingdom, as Ava was tasked with guarding the king's Child of Dark. This Child of Dark is Alsana, and as you would expect, she is our third daughter of Manus, but her story is a lot less destructive. When Alsana was born, she felt fear. This is because she was a manifestation of Manus's fears. All of the daughters of the Abyss are a manifestation of something. Nadalia seemed to be Manus's despair, Ilana was possibly a manifestation of Manus's wrath, and Alsana was his fears. But when Alsana was born, the king managed to find her and welcomed her into his kingdom. He provided the comfort she desperately needed and was kind enough to not shun her away even after he discovered her true origins. It's because of this kindness that she stayed in Eleum Lois and continued to fulfill the Ivory King's wish, which was to hold back the Old Chaos. The Old Chaos is the Flame of Chaos, the same one created by the Witch of Izalith. It's unknown when this was discovered by the Ivory King, but once he did find this ancient monstrosity, him and his fellow knights set out to extinguish it, but they were defeated as none had come back. Alsana wants us to defeat the Old Chaos so that we can uphold the mission of the Ivory King. To do this though, we're going to need some other Knights of Eleum Lois, as they are absolutely necessary if you want the fight to be possible. Once we're all set, we can jump down into the Old Chaos again, just like we did with Lost Izalith, and this boss is absolute perfection. Few fights in the Souls games actually get better with summons, and the Ivory King is one of them. I felt like I actually had to apply strategy to an encounter, which was the first time the series has required me to do that. I don't mean strategy in the sense of reading the boss's moves and making sure how to punish and when, as that's just baked into the overall combat of the encounters, but I mean the actual decision making I had to employ, such as which enemy to attack and when, which was something I did not expect I would be doing going into this fight. I was running around finding knights who were outnumbered and assisting them, or if it was the opposite side of the spectrum, I would add myself into the mix, making the fight easier. This is almost necessary for the fight as well, since you're going to be doing the most amount of damage compared to all the other knights, so your decision in this fight will largely impact how the second phase will go. I'm not entirely sure if the knights can die in the first phase, given they have an obscene amount of health, but if they can, it just further adds to my point. Having two giant teams of warriors fighting against one another is one of the greatest things I've ever experienced, and is without a doubt the best fight this game has to offer. From the actual fight to the layout of the arena, which is engulfed in the fire from the flame of chaos, it was just all perfect, and would have been such a great way to end this trilogy of additional content. But never in my life have I seen a DLC do so well all throughout the entirety of its runtime, only to fumble at the finish line. The Frigid Outskirts is an optional location that the player can discover towards the end of the DLC, and it is awful. It's not only painstakingly difficult, just from the design alone, it might actually be the worst level in any Souls game ever made. The bonfire before entering the coffin is the only bonfire in the area, meaning you have to go from one end of the map to the other just to get to the boss fight, which is just two more of the Ivory King's pets. Their lore is thankfully super basic and not important at all, as their job was just to hunt exiles that were presumably sent out of the kingdom and into the Frigid Outskirts. This area would not be nearly as hard if the horses didn't keep spawning every few feet, not only wasting your time, but draining your Estus in the process, making the boss fight that much harder. It's just an awful location, and I think the more that I talk about it, the closer I get to going insane, so we're just gonna cut it right here. As a complete package, the DLCs were pretty solid. There were things in each that I found a little unpleasant, like the method of storytelling or an entire area, but there was many things I liked about the DLCs, and due to this confliction, I can't say that together they're perfect, but they're nowhere near close to being bad. It's hard to judge though whether this was an actual improvement over Artorias of the Abyss, considering that was one DLC with half the content that played out over half the time. This is also due to the Souls games business model. If people complain about anything regarding the DLCs of the Souls games, it's that they're too short rather than too long. Whereas many games like to make additional content with run times of up to 6 to 20 hours, Dark Souls is pretty much content with 2. It never overstays its welcome. In fact, it sometimes leaves too early, and doing this gives us less time to learn about the DLCs and the locations they reside in. But as I said at the top of the section, as a complete package, they were pretty great. With all the crowns in our inventory, we can revisit Vendrick, who will now provide us with some very important dialogue.
The Abyss once had form, but then dissipated. And yet, traces of its existence endured. Each fragment, thirsting for power, spread dark with no relent. My dear Chandra was one such fragment.
So we now know the fourth and final daughter of Manus, Nashandra, the Queen of Drang Lake. Nashandra is a manifestation of Manus' feelings of power and want. She came to this land in order to covet the First Flame. This explains why Vendrick was in the Undead Crypt. Vendrick left the kingdom because he discovered Nashandra's true origins, and not only locked himself away in the crypt, which was guarded by one of his loyal knights, but he also hid his soul, as Vendrick doesn't drop this upon his death. It's hidden behind a secret door only accessible to those who are human, and Nashandra never truly was. That's why she's been so adamant that we succeed Vendrick. She figures that we'll blindly follow her orders so that we can clear all the obstacles in her path, because once we finally get to the Throne of Want and defeat the knights guarding it, she appears. Similar to the Ivory King, I found this fight leagues better when the summons were included, mostly due to the narrative aspect, since both Benhart and Vengarl were helped due to me, so it's only right that they return the favor. Her boss design is impeccable, and continues to uphold the standard that the final bosses of the game have, but not even Nashandra is the actual final boss. Aldia is the actual final boss, assuming you fulfilled a few tasks along the way, which is just meeting him a few times in specific locations, and then specifically killing Vendrick before Nashandra. As a final boss fight though, it felt like a bit of a letdown. I think Nashandra had way more intensity and narrative weight behind her. Aldi has been this ominous figure that just shows up, says a bunch of shit, and then leaves, and now all of a sudden I'm supposed to care that we're fighting him. I get why he's fighting us. He's supposed to test our might to see if we're truly going to be the next monarch of the Throne of Want, but that doesn't make it right. The same could be said for Nashandra, given she makes an appearance a whole 2 times in this game, but that seemed to be intentional, as the reveal of Nashandra was supposed to be this mysterious event, which makes makes this next part even more confusing, as the Emerald Herald can literally spoil for us that Nashandra will be coming for us. I completely missed her on the way down, so I never got to hear this, which ultimately made the impact of this cutscene hit harder, which begs the question of why it was mentioned in the first place. I find it hard to believe that many people miss Nashandra at the top of the castle, so they're well aware of who she is, so just keep the mystery hidden until the final moments. It kills the entire impact of the scene if we're just told right before entering that she's gonna fight us. After the defeat of the 3 bosses, we can select our ending, and while this game does have 2 endings, what these endings represent is rather interesting. Our first ending is entering the Throne of Want. This is sort of like the kiln of the First Flame, just a little bit different. It allows us to choose the fate of the world, but we never get to see our choice. It is both the Age of Fire and the Age of Dark ending together. It's never known what our character chooses, but that's the part of the roleplay when it comes to RPGs. We make up the rest of the story. Did our character choose fire? Did they choose dark? Or did they do something else? And that something else is following in the footsteps of Vendrick and Aldia. We leave the throne and search for an answer to the undead curse. We don't know if we'll succeed, but it's worth a try anyway. Doing this is sort of like operating a dig site. Yeah, Vendrick and Aldia spent decades digging, trying to find a solution and failed, but now thanks to them, we know of a decade's worth of methods that won't work, bringing us closer and closer to finding a cure for the curse. And that's the beauty of the second ending. It's not only in perfect sync with the rest of the game as it continues to make the curse the main plot of the story, but it gives us an option that we as players hadn't really considered up until this point. Dark Souls 1 did a phenomenal job of grooming us into believing that there were only 2 choices, but Dark Souls 2 refutes this claim and adds a third. As a final note, Dark Souls 2 was a brilliant game. I went into this game with mild expectations, but was blown away by how impressive the story was and how surprisingly easy it was to grasp. Many questions are still left unanswered and will never be answered, but I left this game with an understanding of its story, its themes, and what emotions it had intended to invoke in me, and that is incredibly admirable. But the world of Dark Souls isn't over. The fire of the world will fade once more, and yet despite the impending doom of the Age of Dark getting closer and closer, no one seems to care. But we'll talk about that in Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 3 is a perfect game due to the way it bookends the entire series, but the only reason that I can say that is because of how much this game is being held up by its predecessors. Dark Souls 3 on its own is still a good game, but without all the effort put into the story from Dark Souls 1 and 2, its narrative wouldn't be as impactful. That's the beauty of the Dark Souls trilogy. It's one of the few series out there that truly feels like a tightly knit game. Many games get sequels, but not many truly feel like a proper sequel, just a game set in the same universe a year or so after the previous game. It might make callbacks to the past game, but not enough to feel like what occurred in that game was important. The Dark Souls trilogy and its repetitive ideas make the games feel properly connected. The Age of Fire, the Undead Curse, Hollowing, and so much more have been a prominent part of the series since its inception, which is why judging these games individually based on their stories is so difficult, as each of these games relies on each other to actually make their story have an impact. Dark Souls 2 and 3 could not exist without Dark Souls 1, and not just because of its world building and important characters, but because it's the game that showed us what the Age of Fire is and why it's important. We then took this information into Dark Souls 2, which showed us how the Age of Fire is not all it's cooped up to be, and how as all the years go by, people are starting to embrace the fire less and less. This all comes to an end at Dark Souls 3, a game that is purely focused on the Age of Dark and why the First Flame needs to go. Each one of these games provides a crucial step in our journey, and without even one of them, every other game loses its meaning. We already talked about the previous 2 games and what they attempt to show to the player, and all these themes, ideas, and plots all converge towards Dark Souls 3, creating one of the best endings in a series I've ever seen. And today, I will explain why. So without wasting any more time, let's get started. So ironically, for a game that's going to be about the Age of Darkness and how much death and decay the current age has caused, it starts off with an incredibly intense soundtrack. It's not even been 10 seconds and this electrified feeling of exhilaration seeps into your body. Dark Souls is back and it's time to kick some ass. This feeling continues right into the intro cinematic, and Dark Souls 3 wastes zero time getting into the story. This is the first time in the trilogy where the game outright tells you who the main bosses are, which are the Abyss Watchers, Aldred Saint of the Deep, and Yorm the Giant. There is also a fourth that isn't mentioned, but we'll discuss them a bit later. Just like before, it's 4 beings who will need to be dealt with in order to succeed, but instead of them being the 4 Lord Soul Users or the 4 Great Ones, it's the 4 Lords of Cinder. The question is, why are they so important? Well, oddly enough, the game tells you, but the pure spectacle of the intro is so hypnotizing you might not even realize what was just said. According to the opening narration, the bells only toll when threatened. The reason they're being threatened is because the fire is fading again, but furthermore, it's because someone doesn't want to link the flame, that person being Prince Lothric. Since the prince doesn't want to link the flame, the Bells of Awakening revived previous Lords of Cinder from past kingdoms. Each of these aforementioned beings I mentioned earlier were people who linked the flame in their lifetimes. The bells assume that if they've linked it already, then they'll do it again. But they all refused. The Abyss Watchers, Aldrich, and Yorm don't want to. In a last-ditch effort to make sure the fire is linked, the Bells of Awakening have awoken other beings who are unkindled. People who have failed to link the fire in the past but are now given a second chance, and we are one such person known as the Ashen One. Our job is to defeat the Lords of Cinder and take their ashes to their thrones, as if they won't come back willingly, then their ashes will serve as a substitute. This is the plot of the game. No small objective in between, like finding Vendrick or ringing the bells. Right away from the get-go, we're tasked with killing these beings and linking the flame. Assuming you've played the previous games already, then you've heard this story twice before and already know what you're getting into, which is why our first boss isn't even 5 minutes into the game. In Dark Souls 1, it took around the same time to fight the Asylum Demon, but the game also taught us about our inventory and weaponry, but also showed us that we can converse with NPCs and used an Estus Flask. Dark Souls 2 took a bit longer with this, as the first boss wasn't for a couple hours and the basic tutorial can take a bit of time to run through. In Dark Souls 3, we start with the Estus Flask, get all our gear, and start our journey immediately. There is no hand-holding here, as the game assumes you've done this all before and don't need much of a refresher. The reason why they put Eudix in here is because he's supposed to test our strength. Not just the Ashen One's strength, but ours, since Dark Souls 3 underwent some drastic changes in regards to its combat. And for those who have noticed, yes, I'm using an axe again. It wasn't until starting this game that I realized I had used an axe for all 3 of them, so I figured it'd be quite comical if I beat the entire trilogy with the same weapon. Before killing Eudix though, we'll see him become engulfed in this black form. This is called the Pus of Man. This is a unique disease that is taking over the kingdom, and it originates from the Abyss. Similar to how Manus' humanity went wild, causing him to become the ferocious beast that we know in game, it's possible that this is happening to other Hollows, but on a much grander scale, as this won't be the last time we see this Pus of Man in the game. After Eudix, we can take the coiled sword from his body and use it to create the bonfire at the new Firelink Shrine. I absolutely love the design of Firelink Shrine. From the moment you walk in and see all the thrones lined up around the bonfire, you feel a sense of comfort. It's definitely my favorite across the entire series, but I loathe its location. Firelink Shrine feels so disconnected from the rest of the world. Even though Majula was on the outskirts of Drangleic Castle, it at least became a nexus for all the various paths that the player could traverse to. The cherry on top here is that we can't even travel to the first location, we're forced to teleport to it. It just further shuts this place away from the rest of the kingdom. There's no incentive to explore the other areas of the level, as we've already seen everything it has. I never understood why the series slowly moved towards this idea, but it seemed to be a massive hit amongst the team, as this would be used in other games going forward. From a pure gameplay perspective, the Firelink Shrine of Dark Souls 3 also reverts the changes in Dark Souls 2 to keep things more simplistic. Andre is back and will handle anything regarding our weapons, from upgrades to infusions, and the Shrine Handmaid becomes our all-encompassing merchant, so no more clutter like in Dark Souls 2. We also have our new level up lady, who is just the Firekeeper. She doesn't have any unique backstory like the Emerald Herald, but her condition does spark a few questions. It seems that all the Firekeepers have some sort of condition that afflicts them. Anastasia, the lady under Firelink Shrine, will initially be mute and cannot be spoken to. The Dark Moon Knightis in On Orlando has a disfigured appearance, which is why she hides it from us with her armor, and this Firekeeper is blind. This has always been fascinating to me, as I've never been able to fully understand why this is the case. It's possible that this is a sort of rite of passage, and the Firekeepers are showing their willingness to the flame by giving up something, but what they lose seems to differ across the games. It's possible that this is just a coincidence, but there's also an NPC in the game we'll meet called Irina, who tries to be a Firekeeper and is also blind. Firekeepers being blind only occurs in Dark Souls 3, so I've always wondered why blindness is occurring now instead of across the series. It's something we never get an answer to, but definitely a fascinating topic to discuss. Speaking of the characters in Firelink Shrine, I want to talk about the NPCs though before we embark on our journey. Third time's the charm, as they say, since the NPCs of this game are handled way better than in the previous 2 titles. My issue with each game is that Dark Souls 1 kept replaying the same fate of hollowing across all of its characters, which started losing its value very quickly, and Dark Souls 2 seemed to just make characters for their rewards rather than their stories. But Dark Souls 3 seems to fix this issue. The quantity of the NPCs has been drastically reduced, as there are only around 27 or so in the main game. There's also very little overlap in the merchants, as each school of magic has one designated NPC with the exception of pyromancy. And while Greyrat does have a pretty useless inventory for the most part, since he's a thief you can actually send him to find gear, which will increase his options. This was so much better, as I didn't have to run around the base finding the one merchant who sells the item I need. Furthermore, the actual quests of the NPCs were much more enjoyable this time around. There was 5 standout characters for Dark Souls 3. But one interesting change with this game though is that the NPCs connect with the main content. Both Sigurd and Henri have a connection with a specific Lord of Cinder, and Uria's questline ends up becoming one of the endings of the game. I really liked this idea, as so far the NPCs have been separate from the main bosses, so it was nice to see it all intertwine with one another. It'll be a lot easier to explain what their questlines are alongside the main content, so we'll hold off on this for now. Which means the only other two that we have to talk about that have a more traditional questline are Irina and Cirrus. As we talked about before, Irina is blind, and this is because she came from her land of Karim to become a firekeeper. You might recognize the name Karim, as Oswald the Trek and the Marvelous Chester from Dark Souls 1 are all from Karim. The reason we find Irina here in this cell is because she's failed and hasn't become a firekeeper yet. Due to this failure, she believed that she was unfit to tend the flames and fell into a deep depression. The knight guarding her is Aegon of Karim and has a sworn duty to protect her no matter her state of being. To progress her questline, we need to buy her spells. If we buy her miracles, then we'll be able to give her the enlightenment she needed and will eventually become a firekeeper at Firelink Shrine. Gameplay wise, she's pretty useless in this state, as not only is there already a firekeeper, but she's also hundreds of feet away from the player as opposed to the actual firekeeper who is right next to you. If we, however, only buy her dark miracles, we further progress the ferocity of the humanity within inside of her, causing her to be consumed by its dark power. This turns Aegon hostile, who will fight you for betraying her. She will eventually start to become worried and asks us to touch her again so that she can tell who is nearby, but eventually she will not recognize our touch and asks to be killed. It's a genuinely sad outcome, and this emotion is heightened further because we're the ones that caused it. Had we instead just kept purchasing her regular miracles, we could have saved her from her impending fate. It's a questline of two extremes, one where she gets everything she wants, and one where she loses everything, and it all depends on you. As for Cirrus, she starts out as some random person who appears at Firelink Shrine. Cirrus seems to be a Dark Moon Blade since she uses the Dark Moon Blade spell, which can only be acquired by those a part of the Covenant. But Yorshka, the leader of said Covenant, states that we'll be the only knight in the group if we join. Furthermore, Cirrus says that she is a former servant of the divinity, which may imply that she was a Dark Moon Blade but left some time later. As for why she left, it seems to be related to the two people we fight against throughout her questline, who are Creighton and Hodrick. Creighton is the same one from Dark Souls 2, although this does not imply that he was the canon winner between him and Pate, as this was probably thousands of years ago, and I'm assuming that Creighton is also unkindled, as he most likely was revived alongside us. Cirrus says that Creighton was a part of the Rosaria's Fingers, a rival covenant and one that she despises, and Hodrick seems to be her grandfather. The reason we know this is because she calls out to him before the fight, and when defeated she says that she's pleased that her granddad can rest in peace. Hodrick seems to have gone mad at some point, and Cirrus wanted to put him out of his misery. She has a short but sweet questline, and the family connection to Hodrick was quite the shock. The question still remains though, what is the Sunless Realms, because her full name is Cirrus of the Sunless Realms. It's nice to speculate about it, but there isn't much information to go off of, and this is a running trend throughout the series and personally something I'm not a fan of. There are so many locations in the game that we learn about, like Astora, Karim, Katarina, Mira, Alkin, Ven, and so many more, but there's no in-depth lore about them. Hell, most of them don't even give us a surface level idea of what they're about. This is not a Dark Souls 3 issue and more of a series issue, as the devs have been given 3 chances to develop some of these places, and From Software has just refused to do so. Many people, including myself, have tried to speculate on more details regarding these kingdoms, but there's so little to go off of that it's not even worth it. Their inclusion in the game was probably because the team wanted to add a bit of flavor to the world to not only show that the main kingdom isn't the only kingdom in the Dark Souls universe, but also that people from all over are flocking to this kingdom in search of something important. It just feels like a wasted opportunity to barely mention these places after 3 whole games. As a whole, Dark Souls 3 has some great questlines, and I would go as far to say that it's the most polished out of the entire series. Dark Souls 3 recognized what was wrong with the previous 2 entries and made sure not to repeat those same mistakes again. With the NPCs done, we can now resume our objective, which as a reminder is to defeat the Lords of Cinder and use their ashes as kindling so that we may travel to the kiln of the First Flame and relink the fire. To do this though, we actually need 5 Lords of Cinder. The Abyss Watchers, Yorm, Prince Lothric, Aldrich, and Ludlith. The reason I said 4 earlier is because Ludlith is actually the only one who complies with the rules, as he's already at Firelink Shrine when we arrive. Ludlith's throne says that he was exiled from his homeland. The reason why he was exiled was because of his art of transposition. For gameplay purposes, this allows us to take the boss souls and make weapons out of them just like the past games. What's odd though is that when he dies, he drops the skull ring, which talks about a being called the Soul Feeder and how it was this insatiable beast that hungered for souls. Due to the ambiguity of his past, it's led to many theories such as Ludlith being a Soul Feeder himself but was at one point defeated, which is why he has no legs and possibly can't fit on his throne. It is also entirely possible that Ludlith is just someone who wants to do the right thing and has no ill intentions, but the skull ring terrain definitely leaves a lot up to the imagination. To get to the other 4 lords, we'll need to use the bonfire at Firelink Shrine, which will take us to the High Wall of Lothric, and it is absolutely stunning. You're immediately greeted with an entire view of the castle, and it's a breathtaking view, but it's also an illusion. The kingdom of Lothric is riddled with corpses, and those who survived either became hollows or are still seen defending a lifeless kingdom. Lothric is governed by the 3 pillars of rule: the knights who protect the kingdom, the scholars who run the Grand Archives, and the High Priestess who also served as Prince Lothric's wet nurse. Those who abide by these rules are the Lothric Knights, but these Winged Knight variants are said to be heretics as they don't accept their rules. This is because of Gertrude, the Heavenly Daughter. In the Grand Archives, we can find a birdcage cell with a dead body in it. This is assumed to be Gertrude. She was one of the Queen's holy maidens, although depending on some item descriptions, she may also have been her daughter. One day, Gertrude was visited by an angel, and through this was able to establish the angelic faith of Lothric. Seeing as this isn't a part of the regular 3 pillars, Gertrude was taken and imprisoned. Those who agreed with her teachings, though, band together to defeat the current rulers of Lothric, which led to a massive civil war. Out of all the 3 kingdoms we visited so far in the trilogy, the kingdom of Lothric is easily in the worst state. This condition that we see the castle in may also symbolize the world of Dark Souls itself. I'll elaborate more on this idea later, but it's my personal theory that not only did our characters from Dark Souls 1 and 2 link the flame, but every person in between these games did so as well. If we go back to the intro, the narrator says that Lothric is where the transitory lands of the Lords converge, meaning this isn't like the past games. In Dark Souls 1, all the main bosses were within Lordran already, but in Dark Souls 3, the lands of these lords have been forced together. It's unclear how this is even possible, but it may go back to the first flame. The world of Dark Souls is dying. It's a shadow of its former self. Places are being buried, destroyed, and created in an endless loop. The intro does a great job of showing this, but the one area that truly opened my eyes to this was Dreg Heap. This place is covered in rubble and buildings that span so far and wide that you can't even tell what the buildings used to be or when they were built. We talked about how time was convoluted in Dark Souls 1, but in Dark Souls 3 this has been progressed even further. Lands are being moved together, creating a tidal wave of rubble, and it's all because the first flame. If you watched the past videos, you may have noticed how worse things have gotten throughout the series, and I believe this is because the first flame hasn't been snuffed out. People are still clinging on to that illusion of life, as Aldia put it, and are willing to stay in the comfort of what they know rather than step out into the unknown. And because of that, the world has gotten even worse. Each Dark Souls game has tried to push the player toward one specific idea: the Age of Fire in 1, the Breaking of the Curse in 2, and the Age of Dark in 3. Everyone in Dark Souls 3 is just doing what they continue to do because it's all they know. Some are blindly following their faith, and others are continuing to work on their craft. This game truly conveys the attitude and the effects of a dying world, one that is practically begging to be put out of its misery. It's basically saying, look at all of this in-game. Look at the destruction of the kingdoms, the ruins of the world, and the people who inhabit it. Do you think any of them are truly happy to be alive right now? Not even the Lords of Cinder, beings who have insurmountable power, don't even want to link the flame. It lays all of this out for you and asks you to choose, which is quite a heavy burden. Choosing to go against the status quo that has been said for who knows how long is a very hard decision, but at least we don't have to make that choice now, as the game will blindside us again and create another boss encounter for us to be hypnotized by. We'll talk about Vort later though, as he does have ties to another boss later in the game. After Vort, we'll be taken to the Undead Settlement. This place functions like the Undead Burg in Dark Souls 1, as this place was the residence of many of the kingdom's undead. But one thing we'll see immediately upon entry is this massive pile of corpses at the end of the bridge. These beings are pilgrims that are most likely from the kingdom of Londor, as the only survivor is Yol of Londor. He is related to Yuria, however, so we will have to discuss him a bit later. As we explore the Undead Settlement, we can see that this place is in just as bad of shape as Lothric Castle. Bodies are piled up everywhere, and some have even been put into cages. This land has also been subjected to various curses, and because of this, many of the settlement's inhabitants sealed them away in a spirit tree, but would end up cursing the tree itself, which would lead to the creation of the cursed rotted Greatwood. During the second phase, the Greatwood will slam into the ground and will discover the true resting place of all the settlement's hollows in the aptly named Pit of Hollows. It's unclear though whether or not the hollows that were dumped here were alive or not upon arrival, but since the Moundmaker's Covenant is down here, it's possible that they were thrown in here alive and all fought to the death, which would explain the plethora of bones covering the walls. But it could also be that these people actually banded together to create the Moundmaker's Covenant. Regardless, it's clear that their fates were sealed the moment they were thrown in. While the curse-rotted Greatwood is to the left of the dilapidated bridge, if we instead go to the right, we'll make it to the Road of Sacrifices and subsequently Farron Keep, which leads us to our first Lord of Cinder, the Abyss Watchers. Farron Keep is rather interesting, as not only is it the resting place for the Abyss Watchers, but it may also be the ruins of Ulasil. In this area, we can find the Golden Scroll and the Dusk Crown, items that have ties to Ulasil. And we can also find dead mushrooms and maybe even the final resting place of Elizabeth if this taller mushroom is assumed to be her. This would also fit narratively with the Abyss Watchers, as they were a part of an organization dedicated to fighting the Abyss, and seeing as Manus was located under Ulasil, this would tie together quite nicely. The Abyss Watchers were the main fighting force of a group called the Undead Legion of Farron, who took inspiration from Artorias and dedicated their lives to fighting the Abyss. But their group numbers seem to be much larger than they seem, as these monstrous beings are seen guarding the Abyss Watcher's boss arena. They even managed to recruit one of the twin crystal sages that is said to have betrayed his scholarly friends of the Grand Archives to ally with the Undead Legion. As for the Abyss Watchers themselves, it's said that they all share the blood of the wolf, most likely in reference to this wolf found in the area, and used its blood to increase their power. And their power was unmatched, as not only were they able to hunt together like a pack of wolves, but they've been known to bury an entire kingdom at the slightest sign of the Abyss. This group would eventually link the flame, presumably in an attempt to cast away the Abyss for good, but with their main force gone, the rest of the forces dwindled and left the Undead Legion, as there was nothing else to do. But as we know, the Abyss can't be destroyed that easily. It eventually came back and went unchecked since none of the Legion were around, and managed to turn their land into a festering swamp. These monstrosities that we see may have been Legion soldiers who were corrupted by the Abyss. When the Abyss Watchers awoke, they came to the realization that their home was overrun and their mission was unsuccessful. And while it's not stated when this happened, at some point some of the members became tainted with the Abyss itself, which leads to the cutscene before the boss fight, where they're all fighting one another as they're trying to fight back against the Abyss, but since they're all undead, they're constantly being revived, so they're stuck in this never-ending battle between each other, which is likely why they won't link the flame. Doing it the first time didn't stop the Abyss, and they have more important things to do than sit on their throne and let the Abyss consume the world. I absolutely love the Abyss Watchers, and not just from a lore perspective, but also as a boss. What really sold the fight for me was the hints of Artorias that were spread throughout their movesets. The Undead Legion took inspiration from Artorias, so it's only right that they mimic his fighting style, and the fast-paced leaping attacks that they have really reminded me of that fight. Furthermore, this fight's quality increases tenfold once the other members join in, as it turns this honorable duel into this chaotic mess. You lose all focus during this fight, as you're having to keep track of 3 different Abyss Watchers who can slide across the arena in a second, and the second phase is just as deadly, as the last dead Abyss Watcher consumes the blood of all his brethren in a last-ditch attempt to stop us. He's a lot faster than last time and produces flames from his sword, which makes the fight even harder. It shows how dedicated the group is to their mission, and how they'll use anything they can as long as they win, similar to how Artorias fought us with all his strength and even a broken arm. From both a presentation and gameplay perspective, the Abyss Watchers are fantastic Lords of Cinder, and the best way to introduce the player to the sheer power these lords hold. Behind the Abyss Watchers is the Catacombs of Karthus, a place that has seemingly no actual kingdom, as this Karthus is never seen in game, but given that Wolnir is located down here and is known to be a lord consumed by the Abyss, maybe the Abyss Watchers leveled the entire kingdom. And while that is an interesting idea to think about, what's more important is actually what's underneath the catacombs. If we break this bridge and use it as a ladder, we can enter the Smoldering Lake, the original location of Lost Izalith and possibly Ash Lake. In here we can see giant structures that look very similar to arch trees of Ash Lake, and given the geography of Lordran, Ash Lake and Lost Izalith weren't too far from one another, so it wouldn't be a stretch to assume that they can exist in the same location. If we continue deeper into the lake, we'll see dozens of dead demons that resemble the Capra, Taurus, and Stray Demon from Dark Souls 1. It's very clear that the demon race is dying and that they're struggling to survive. We can even see this in the Stray Demon near Faring Keep, which is covered in stone rather than the flesh and blood that we're used to. There's even the old Demon King, whose boss room is covered in the corpses of his fellow demons. He'll try his best to fight the Ashen One with all his might, but most of his power ran out years ago, and as a last resort will release all his flames in a fiery explosion, but in doing so he'll lose all the power he's ever consumed and will be unable to fight. The demons of Dark Souls 3 are a dying race, and further adds to the theme of death and decay the game is trying to convey. Kingdoms aren't lavish spectacles of beautiful architecture, they're a war zone, and the demon race is no longer a formidable foe, just a dying breed that won't last another generation. The symbolism of this place is beautiful, as it shows that everyone is being affected by the progression of time, and no one is gaining from having this age continue. But not everything needs to have a sad ending, as if we explore the rest of the Smoldering Lake, we can find the corpses of a spider and a woman, and judging from the tome that is located on her body, it seems that Quaylana found the fair lady and got to spend their last moments with one another. It's a wonderful and happy ending. Quaylana got to find her sister, who she thought was dead, and the fair lady is finally able to die and no longer has to suffer anymore. Getting back on track, to get to our next Lord of Cinder, we need to find Irithyll, but to gain entry, we need to find a specific item that is located in the Cathedral of the Deep, the resting place of Aldrich, Saint of the Deep. Aldrich's story is by far the most vague, but also the most detailed amongst the Lords of Cinder, as his story encompasses various other bosses that we've already had the pleasure of meeting. Years ago, Aldrich was a common cleric, but he would eventually start experiencing visions of a deep sea. This deep sea was another form of the Abyss, and it was located in the lowest possible depths imaginable, and formed the core components of the world. We never get to see the deep sea in-game, but it seems to be the lowest layer, something only Aldrich can see. He then shared this info with only those he trusted, who were his archdeacons McDonald, Royce, and Klimt. They not only kept this information within their inner circle, but also encouraged one of Aldrich's insatiable urges. Whether this was something he always had within him, or it came about when he saw visions of the deep, Aldrich had an insatiable urge to consume human flesh. The Archdeacons encouraged this behavior and used their influence to create an army of followers who not only worship Aldrich, but also went out and gathered sacrifices for him. That's why these evangelists are located in the undead settlement, as they are trying to bring the undead to the cathedral so that they may be consumed by Aldrich. We also learn that he would eat anyone, even including children, as Henri and Horace are said to be the only two children who managed to escape Aldrich's grasp. Where Henri and Horace are located happens to be the Road of Sacrifices, the path that the settlers and evangelists took to get to the cathedral before consumption. This cathedral performed all manner of rituals and cleansings in order to purify those who entered its doors. After numerous sacrifices, the people around Aldrich managed to go insane, and even though Aldrich himself was able to keep his sanity, his form would change rapidly as he would eventually become the black sludge that we see in the intro. Due to his immense power, he was used as a Lord of Cinder, but seeing as Aldrich was fully consumed by the visions of a deep sea, linking the fire would be the opposite of what he had planned, so this implies that it was linked against his will. They would eventually return Aldrich's body to the cathedral to be placed inside the large coffin seen in the Deacons of the Deep boss fight. These deacons were led by the archdeacons we discussed earlier, but while Aldrich was laying in his coffin, another piece was added to the board. Pontiff Sullivan was a former resident of the painted world of Ariandel. Just like the world of Dark Souls, the painted worlds have their own cycles that need to be rekindled in a sense. Well, the Pontiff lived in the current painted world of Ariandel, but felt no reason to continue his life here as he had not experienced any hardship or despair. We'll learn about the painting's residence in the DLC, but unlike the painted world of Ariamis, which was a world for all the things the gods feared, Ariandel was for those who had nowhere else to go and are without purpose. Sullivan would then set out in search of a purpose and would eventually come across Irithyll. This place is very relevant to the story, as right next to it is Anor Londo, the same one from Dark Souls 1. From various item descriptions, we learn that Gwendolyn didn't actually die in Dark Souls 1, as he is still very much alive in this game. Now, whether or not the chosen undead never fought him or they killed him but he somehow revived himself is unknown and ultimately irrelevant. But with Gwendolyn being the only god left in Anor Londo, he tried to reach out to those in his extended family in hopes of trying to rebuild the god's rule. The only one he managed to find though was Yorshka, a crossbreed girl similar to Priscilla. It's unclear what her relationship with Gwendolyn was or even her relationship with Priscilla was, but all we know is that she was content with helping Gwendolyn in his objective. Gwendolyn would also reinstate the Dark Moon blades as a way to help protect them from any adversaries. One of their knights, though, happened to be Pontiff Sullivan, who infiltrated its ranks and managed to corrupt all the members he came across. He would then end up enacting his plan when Gwendolyn was stricken with an illness that left him unable to care for his covenant or city. Sullivan, in one successful swoop, managed to imprison Yorshka in a nearby tower and throw Gwendolyn inside Anor Londo Cathedral, allowing him to have complete control of Irithyll, which is how he earned the title of Pontiff. In order to ensure protection of his new kingdom, the Pontiff would not only set Irithyll knights in various positions as guards, create a barrier over the whole city so that no one could enter, but also send Outrider knights to conquer other lands. We've already seen a few Outrider knights across the game already, but the two most notable knights are Vort and the Dancer of the Boreal Valley. Not much is known about the duo, except the fact that the Dancer was a daughter from one of the royal families in Irithyll. Whether she served willingly or not is unknown. Either way, both of their fates would end up the same, as they were both bestowed a ring given by the Pontiff, which would end up slowly turning them into these malformed beasts. After an unknown amount of time, Aldrich would reawake again as a Lord of Cinder and would foresee the world's eventual destruction at the hands of the Deep Sea. Due to this premonition, though, he would neglect the throne and wait for the Deep to overcome the world. And it was during this waiting that he would dream of the old gods and how they wanted to relink the flame. He saw this as a ploy against his own wishes and sought to devour the very gods. He then traveled to Irithyll, decimated the knights guarding the city, and forced the Pontiff to surrender, who gave up control of Anor Londo, allowing Aldrich to have an audience with Gwendolyn. What happened next is what we see during the boss fight. We interrupt Aldrich mid-consumption, who now has to use the barely conscious body of Gwendolyn as a weapon to defeat us. Aldrich seems to have very supernatural powers, as his soul when transposed can give us the Dark Moon longbow, which belonged to Gwendolyn, but also the Life Hunt scythe that belonged to Priscilla. But interestingly though, he never consumed Priscilla, only dreamed of her. From what I can gather, it seems that Aldrich can acquire abilities from those he consumed, and is also able to peer into that person's memories. The reason he was able to acquire the Life Hunt scythe is because it's a miracle. Miracles in Dark Souls are like stories. You're essentially reciting a story and using the talisman as a medium for the power. So Aldrich consumed Gwendolyn and dreamt of Priscilla during the consumption, and then learned the story of the Life Hunt scythe and was able to cast it, since it's basically just the equivalent of reading a story again. Earlier I said Aldrich had the most detailed story out of the Lords of Cinder, and I wasn't lying. His story doesn't just include include himself, but 5 other bosses and close to a dozen named characters. It is a very long story to wrap your head around, but it is the kind of storytelling that got me interested in these games in the first place. It showcases all the different events from different points of view and how these characters fit into one cohesive timeline. But just as the story is detailed, so too is it vague. The deep sits on a shelf alongside many of the concepts of the Dark Souls universe that are barely touched upon. In its defense though, the deep does have a lot of item descriptions tied to it, so we can at least get a better understanding of what its true nature is, but seeing as it's never shown to us in game or ever elaborated on further than what we talked about, it just becomes another idea in the world of Dark Souls that leaves a lot open to the interpretation. As for the boss fight, Aldrich was pretty entertaining, but I think a much better boss fight in my opinion was Pontiff Sullivan. I've always liked Sullivan's design, and plus the walk towards him is always very ominous, as you don't know what to expect, especially when he dashes right at you the moment you get too close. Fort and the Dancer were pretty much on the same level as Aldrich in my opinion. I still think Pontiff ranks higher than all of them, but they were really entertaining fights. And honestly, this opinion I have is pretty much the same for most of the bosses in this game. Even Eudix was an entertaining fight, and he was the first boss we ever face. It's clear that the quality of the bosses has been raised thanks to Dark Souls 3, and I think one reason for this was because the team reverted the previous ideas of Dark Souls 2, and instead focused on the quality again rather than the quantity. Each fight brought some sort of unique twist so that it never felt like you were in some traditional fight, as that's what the enemies were for. Even fights I dislike due to their lack of difficulty, like the Deacons, are still at least mildly impressive, as it's leagues better than the Congregation from Dark Souls 2, which I'm assuming was the inspiration for it. Those enemies between the bosses are allowed to have basic attacks and a combo or two, but the bosses are where all the creative talent is supposed to be spilled into. It felt like there was real passion behind these bosses again, from their designs to their movesets, and that's one of the reasons Dark Souls 3 is held in such a high regard within the franchise. The other reason may also be down to the locations themselves. There is beauty in destruction, as they say, and Dark Souls 3 proves time and time again how this is possible. The catacombs, the cathedral, and the smoldering lake are all great examples of this, but the way the game shifts this idea and instead showcases beauty through architecture again, through the lens of things like Irithyll and Anor Londo, is genius. Even the smallest things like looking over a ledge and seeing the rest of the kingdom, or just walking through the hallway that leads to Gwyn's tomb, are beautiful, not only because we get to see some of these locations in a new, more updated light, but because From Software has always expertly crafted its levels to showcase these moments for us. That's one of the reasons Anor Londo was so beloved amongst the community, as not only was it the first area that showed actual signs of life in the world of Lore Jam, but its design was a sight to behold. Even Anor Londo in its current state still holds that beauty, it's just a different kind of beauty. Not how various pieces of architecture can create a godlike city that people can only dream of, but how despite its destruction and loss of life, Anor Londo still manages to be a beacon of light and upholds the massive significance that it displayed in Dark Souls 1. After the defeat of Aldrich, if we retrace our steps back to Irithyll, we can find a separate path that leads to the profane capital, ruled by Yorm the Giant. Interestingly though, we don't just arrive in the capital, as upon exiting through this hole in the wall, we arrive in the Irithyll dungeon. This place is a massive and convoluted prison filled with all manner of beings who have been imprisoned and tortured and abused by all the jailers. These jailers are said to hail from the profane capital, but later served under the rule of Pontiff Sullivan. They're also very ruthless in their methods when it comes to subduing escapees, as they have a poisonous mist that saps your health away, and use a smoldering piece of hot iron that not only burns at the touch, but will hinder your ability to run away, as you temporarily fat roll when afflicted. If you manage to escape the prison, you'll be greeted by the underground city of the profaned capital. From a pure spectacle or design perspective, I think Shulva had a much better greeting upon its entry, but the profaned capital is still nice to look at. It is admittedly quite small. This could once again be due to the geological shift of the lands towards Lothric, but that doesn't ignore the fact that the devs could have done a bit more with its design. You'll likely spend more time in the adjacent dungeon than in the actual capital. While the area does lack in length, it does try to circumvent the issue a bit by adding a bit more depth. The capital is covered in various trinkets, goblets, and burned corpses, and these bodies don't just stop at the entrance, they are in every section of the capital. It's trying to get the player to wonder what exactly happened here. Well, the capital was under attack by a new flame, called the Profaned Flame. This was a curse created by a group of women, and while they did become disfigured and turn into these creatures we see just outside the capital, they did manage to win in the end, as it pretty much killed every single person who resided in said capital. But this is where Yorm came in, as he attempted to stop this profane flame before it caused any damage by linking the flame and becoming a Lord of Cinder, but it didn't work as the aforementioned destruction followed shortly after. The main question surrounding it though is, why did these women create such a thing, and how? Well, it's possible that it may have ties to the Abyss, as both Carla the Witch and the profaned Cole, who are both found in the Irithyll dungeon, have ties to the Abyss.
You're here to save me, but I'm guilty. A wretched child of the Abyss.
Lords,
Where did you happen upon this coal? This is much too dark. I see the abyss in it.
Furthermore, we need to look at the Pontiff and Eleonora. Pontiff carries a sword called the Profaned Greatsword, which states that Sullivan discovered an unfading flame below the tundra of Irithyll. And the axe Eleonora can be dropped from these monstrous creatures, which says that the women who triggered the curse were relatives of a certain oracle. These words, tundra, Irithyll, a land covered in snow, and oracle all point to Aleum Lois and Alsana being this oracle. From what we just talked about regarding the smoldering lake and what we know from the old chaos in Aleum Lois, it's clear that the flame of chaos is dying, so maybe this is an altered version of the flame of chaos, or at least maybe the last few sparks of it. It's definitely a stretch, but the Profaned Flame has always been interesting to me, as the last time a new flame was mentioned in the series, well, we kinda know how that went. Upon his revival though, Yorm saw the state of his city and was in utter shock at what had occurred. So now he sits in despair, unwilling to link the flame, but despite how depressing it would be to kill him, we not only need his ashes, but a friend also needs to uphold his promise.
Yorm, old friend. I, Siegfried of the Knights of Katarina, have come to uphold my promise. Let the sun shine upon this Lord of Cinder.
When Yorm became the ruler of his kingdom, many of the people disapproved of him. In an effort to gain their trust, he created two weapons called the Storm Rulers and gave one to his people should he ever step out of line, and the other to his best friend Sigurd, who promised to kill him should he come back to life. This is also the final step in Sigurd's questline and was the main reason I enjoyed it so much, as being able to fight alongside an NPC such as him against a giant sounds like a blast. But despite the wonderful presentation and design of Yorm's character, it's easily the most underwhelming fight in the game. Using the Storm Ruler is the only way to do real damage to Yorm. The main attack of the Storm Ruler is the weapon art that produces a slash of wind capable of downing him. But that's just it. It's just the same move over and over again. Doing this alone is easy, and with Sigurd it becomes even easier, as you can almost stun lock Yorm for a large portion of the battle. And for this to occur during a fight with a Lord of Cinder is pretty pathetic. On top of this, Yorm's second phase doesn't really change anything, it just adds a bit of fire to his weapon. I feel like there was much more potential for Yorm, but it was never given to us. Thankfully, this wouldn't be the last time this idea would exist in a Souls game, as Elden Ring repurposed this idea and it was much better handled there. Our final Lord of Cinder is Prince Lothric, the one who started this problem in the first place, but the real question is why? It's the one thing that's been rattling in my head since the very beginning. Why did Lothric refuse to link the flame? Well, the answer is honestly a bit sad. Prince Lothric was born to die. The rulers of Lothric were King Osiris and his queen. Osiris had 3 children named Lorien, Lothric, and Ocelot. Lorien was the first and was a formidable soldier on the battlefield who was able to single-handedly defeat the demon prince who was said to rule over all the demons. Osiris figured that his lineage could push their power even further by creating a child specifically to become a Lord of Cinder, and Lothric was to be that child. But he failed. Lothric wasn't strong enough, so the family committed a deed so heinous that it cursed him for life. Despite the curse though, it worked, and Lothric was capable of relinking the flame. But his frail body combined with his poor health left him bedridden and resentful. Being the helpful brother that he was, Lorien wanted to combine his soul with Lothric's, but because of Lothric's curse, it consumed Lorien as well, which left him mute and a cripple. Due to this, the current state of the world, and the fact that even his teacher was having doubts about relinking the flame, it ultimately caused Lothric to refuse, and honestly, it's hard to blame him. Being created for the sake of power and not knowing what your sacrifice will truly do is a hard burden to put on a child, especially when you consider how much grooming was presumably done to get Lothric ready to link the flame. Had he been brought up in a different light, this story could have been changed, but due to the greed of the king, it ultimately started a chain of events that would bring about the end of the world. At the very least though, the twin princes weren't the only ones that suffered. Osiris is more dragon than human now and has gone insane because of it. Similar to how Big Hat Logan became deranged from the knowledge he read on Seath, so too did Osiris, and depending on what you believe, he may also be hallucinating. During the fight, he talks about his son Ocelot, and we can infer that he's carrying him in his hand, but nothing is there. This, however, may not be as obvious as it seems. games. There's currently two theories I believe in that argue for and against Ocelot's existence. On one hand, Ocelot may be a hallucination from the king, either because Ocelot died and he can't accept the loss, or that he had been hallucinating the mere idea that he had a child in the first place. However, on the other hand, Ocelot may actually exist but was removed due to some real-world complications. During the second phase of the boss fight, Osiris will scream Ocelot's name, then slam the hand that carries him into the ground, presumably killing him. We can hear a baby crying in the background during the fight, implying that he lived, but I think this was a loophole by From Software to get rid of complaints. Killing kids in games, if I'm not mistaken, will get a game banned just about everywhere, and From Software has honored this rule and rarely ever adds kids to their games to begin with. The only ones that come to mind are Kuro in Sekiro and Father Gascoigne's daughter in Bloodborne, but his daughter is never seen as we're forced to talk to her through a wall, and while Kuro does make an appearance numerous times, he is never shown to be harmed. There are 3 parts in the game that Kuro is actually cut with something, and each time it happens, we never actually see the real act. It is of course implied that he has suffered a wound, but it's never actually shown. From Software most likely wanted to add Ocelot and his death to the game, but couldn't due to the possibility of the game being banned. Personally, I've always been a fan of the 4-party and do believe that the king is not hallucinating and Ocelot was meant to be in the game, because this also connects to the king's current mindset, as he is going so insane that he doesn't even realize the harm he's putting his child in. But to make matters worse, while the king was consumed by Seath's writings on immortality, and the twins were currently suffering through no fault of their own, the queen had just decided to leave. She disappeared quietly into the night from the kingdom and was never seen again. The queen's identity, though, is unknown, but it is heavily theorized to be Guinevere. From Dark Souls 1, we know that Guinevere bestowed divine blessings to her people and was seen as a symbol of bounty and fertility because of it. And the divine blessing of Dark Souls 3 says that the Queen of Lothric was initially revered as a goddess of fertility and bounty. But the issue is that we know that she left Anor Londo and became the wife of a flame god Flann. So how did she go from him to Osiris, and why did she leave him and come back here? Furthermore, if Gwendolyn was actually trying to get the gods back in Anor Londo, how did the two never find one another, and why didn't Guinevere come back? This could have been due to the presence of Aldrich and the Pontiff within the cathedral, but this also calls into question Rosaria, as her soul can create the bountiful sunlight miracle, which is one of the miracles of Guinevere, and given the presentation of both characters from the room's layout to their positions on the bed, it's clear that there is a connection between the two. Whether Rosaria is actually Guinevere or simply someone Guinevere knew is never explicitly told to us, and really in the grand scheme of things it doesn't really matter, but it is a very interesting theory nonetheless. It's clear though, to no one's surprise, that the royal family is in disarray and is currently suffering just like the kingdom is. Despite this though, the Knights of the Kingdom still stay strong and continue to defend the castle against the corruption that is the Pus of Man. But it's starting to fight back, as the Pus of Man is embedded within these twin wyverns and many of the castle's soldiers. And it seems like the Pilgrims of Londor have also started advancing on the castle, as they've managed to control the armor of the Dragon Slayer and use it as a tool of their destruction. After battling through all of this chaos though, we can finally meet the prince himself. The twin princes actually go against the status quo of the game, not just in their decision to refuse the throne, but also in how they're presented to the player. Lothric in a way is this game's Gwyn or Vendrick. He's clearly not on the same level as the other two, but it was Lothric's choices that set the game's plot into motion, just like how Gwyn and Vendrick's choices set their game's plots into motion. But instead of being presented as a shambling corpse, Lothric is the opposite, even if he's just some bedridden child that's cursed with a lifelong illness. The boss fight isn't this sad encounter that makes you feel like you're doing them a service by putting them out of their misery. You're fighting a being who is extremely powerful and is fully conscious of their actions, as opposed to the hollow versions of the other two. It was a wonderful twist, as I expected to be greeted by a somber tune, all while seeing the death and decay that has continued to spread throughout the kingdom reach the prince's chambers, but I didn't, and that surprised me. And now is probably a good time to correct a previous statement of mine. A couple months ago, I made a review on Dark Souls 3. It was a bit more gameplay-centric than this video is, but in that video I said despite loving the twin princes, Lorien had always pissed me off due to his awful teleportation ability. And I want to rectify that statement, as I never felt these feelings this time around. In the previous video on Dark Souls 2, I talked about how the quality of these bosses will always be a subjective opinion, as the boss's enjoyment largely depends on the build and the skill of the player. I naively at the time did not take this into consideration, and never considered that I was the problem. Looking at the gameplay now is downright embarrassing, and I realized that Lorien was never the issue, it was me. Yes, his teleport move does occasionally break line of sight, which is still annoying, but everything was not as bad as I had made it out to be. I always liked the twin princes as a boss fight, that opinion has never changed, but I think I can now officially say that it's not only the best Lord of Cinder fight in the game, but it's easily one of the few fights in Dark Souls 3 that I consider completely perfect. The sheer presence of these two is amazing. The fight is pretty much Lorien versus the player. Lothric is able to protect Lorien with magic and heal him once he dies, the same way the player can heal with Estus and use their equipment to aid them. Lothric is like the support role in this duo, but he's also the main character that needs to be defeated, as he can obviously revive Lorien, but his magic forces the player to not engage them, prolonging the fight even longer than it already is, giving Lorien enough time to finish us off. And the fact that the duo manages to be a threat no matter the distance always adds to the intensity of the fight. I've always been one to admit when I'm wrong, and accept the fact that my opinions are never meant to be set in stone and can always be changed, and this playthrough thoroughly changed my mind about this fight, as the Twin Princes are not only worthy of the title Lord of Cinder, but were such an excellent boss to put at the end of the journey. Out of all the Souls games, I ended up talking about these bosses the most out of any in the trilogy, and this is due in part to the Lord of Cinders being the only objective in the game, so talking about them is really all we can discuss. They are the main focus of the game, and thus need to have detailed lore to back it up. This was forgivable in the other games, as while those beings did have some importance in the world, they weren't the main focus, but in Dark Souls 3, they are. If it wasn't for the Lords of Cinder, we wouldn't have a game, so they ended up becoming the main focus of the story, and the devs managed to deliver. Aldrich is a testament to that statement, as I may have spent more time on them than any character in the series, with the exception of the Witch of Izalith, who coincidentally also had numerous bosses and characters tied to her plot. I was really impressed by the overall presentation of this game, especially when it came to our 4 Lords of Cinder, even including Yorm, who had a wonderful design and presentation despite the fight being a bit lackluster. Their lore was rich with details, and the item descriptions were long enough to create an essay's worth of information, but also left enough info out to keep that Souls spirit of finding the context clues and filling in the gaps. Plus, the encounters with said bosses made the time spent getting to them worth it. Even Yorm, as once again, despite being disappointing, there was at least an attempt to create the spectacle of tackling a monolithic-sized giant. But if there was one thing that bothered me about this game, it was the lack of attention given to Dark Souls 2. Narratively, this actually fits quite well, as Drangleic was supposed to be seen as this unimportant kingdom that would be easily toppled and replaced with something else in time, only to be forgotten by the rest of the world. But if the point was to make the kingdom feel unimportant, why are there constant references to it, like Kraton appearing in Cirrus's quest, Lucatiel's armor and Aslatiel's sword resurfacing in the game, the dead giant at Firelink Shrine, and not only a portrait of Nishandra, but of Aleum Lois and Broom Tower found in Irithyll. It just feels confusing. It's like the team actively wants the player to know that despite not making Dark Souls 2, they are aware and care about the game, but barely put in the effort to justify it. What is truly the most upsetting part about this is that both Vendrick and Aldia, to my knowledge, are never mentioned once throughout the game. There is one magic spell found in the Grand Archives that says the words "the first of the scholars," which many people have pointed towards a link to Aldia, but he was a scholar of the first sin, not a first scholar. Plus, the first of the scholars could refer to the scholars of the Grand Archives, not Aldia. It's a shame because they were the only beings that we know of who sought to break the curse through unconventional means, and there's zero remnants of their work. The two are never brought up in the game, and the actual structures of Drangleic or Aldia's Keep are never seen in-game. I understand that Dark Souls 2 was not everybody's cup of tea, and maybe the original team wanted to do away with the B team's creation, but you can't deny that Vendrick and Aldia had the potential to create a sizable impact on the story, and for their legacy to be tarnished like this is a bit disappointing. With all the Lords of Cinder dead and their ashes within our inventory, we can now link the First Flame. But before we do that, there is 2 DLCs and a couple other bits of content from the main areas that I want to address first. If we rewind and go back to Osiris and visit the area behind his boss arena, we'll uncover a place called the Untended Graves. This place is identical to the Cemetery of Ash in the beginning of the game, with the only difference being the lighting. It's one of the most talked about locations within the community, as this confusion coupled with this feeling of nervousness settles in, as upon entry you start to recognize all the familiar landscapes and are just bewildered that a place like this even exists. The boss is also identical, as it's Champion Gundyr as opposed to Eudix. According to his boss soul description, Champion Gundyr came to Firelink Shrine to relink the fire, but failed and arrived too late. He was then eventually bested by an unknown warrior, and given the series' heavy use of that term, we can assume that this warrior was us. Afterwards, he then became a sheath for the coiled sword. So similar to Ulasil and the Memory of the Giants, we can go back in the past, kill Champion Gundyr, who then becomes a sheath for the coiled sword, in hopes another warrior will come and use it to link the flame, who just happens to be us. We then take the sword from his present body as Udix Gundyr and use it at the bonfire. If we happen to defeat Champion Gundyr though, we'll be greeted with an identical Firelink shrine, and while the Firekeeper is not here, there are an Eyes of a Firekeeper located inside the building. If we have the eyes in our inventory, Ludlith and the Firekeeper will comment on them. Ludlith refers to the Firekeeper as her, implying that he knows the identity of this person, and the Firekeeper will mention how these eyes reveal frightening images of betrayal in a world without fire. So we can assume that this was in the past, and since Ludlith is familiar with the Firekeeper and is a Lord of Cinder, it's possible that this was during the time he linked the fire. Which would also connect with the intro of the game that says that the Land of Lords are converging together. This land just happens to be Ludlith's. But what doesn't make sense is the Handmaid's dialogue. As in the Dark Firelink Shrine, her attitude seems to imply that the flame is still lit as she tells us to hurry along, but how is this possible? Well, sadly, I don't have an answer for that. The Untended Graves is one of the hardest parts of this game to wrap your head around, which makes discussing it extremely difficult. One explanation though could be that the Firekeeper's eyes are what's causing this darkness, as the world in present-day Dark Souls 3 is getting close to the Age of Dark, as evidenced by the giant dark sign eclipse in the sky, but there's still plenty of light left in this world, whereas in the Untended Graves there's nothing. But if all the light's extinguished, then that implies that this is an Age of Dark, but Ludlith linked the flame and continued the Age of Fire. So that's why I think it's the Eyes of a Firekeeper displaying a vision in the sense of what the world will come to should we enact this grand betrayal, which is letting the flame die out. Another thing of note though is the repair spell in Dark Souls 3, which says that light is time, and the reversal of its effects is a forbidden art. So this implies that the Untended Graves could be like the things betwixt. It's sort of stuck in limbo because there's no light existing and therefore time not existing. Regardless, despite its very confusing backstory, it's probably my favorite location to discuss in the game as there's so many possibilities as what this place truly means. The final location is near Irithyll Dungeon, as we can use the Dragon Pose from the Untended Graves to be transported into Archdragon Peak. We already know that immortality via dragon form is not unheard of, as many people worship the Stone Dragon in Dark Souls 1, Osiris is assumed to be human before he became a dragon, and we can actually find some dragon stones which will turn us into a humanoid dragon similar to the one sitting next to us. So it's pretty safe to assume that this place was used to worship the ancient dragons, despite the fact that they're all dead now. But even though they're all dead, that doesn't mean the other flying types won't exist, as we get to challenge a wyvern shortly after arriving, which at first glance is a pretty cool fight, until you realize that the enemies on the walkways are actually tougher than the boss itself. I can recognize that the team was most likely experimenting with some bold ideas for boss fights, and while it's definitely cool at first, it just feels a bit unnatural, if you will, as completely destroying its health bar in one plunge attack just felt off. Archdragon Peak not only has a questionable first boss, but also raises various questions that admittedly may leave people confused. Two characters have arrived at this location at certain points in time, which are Havel and Ornstein. We find Havel next to a downed dragon, and we find Ornstein's armor towards the end of the level. I can forgive Havel for being here since he's always had a hatred for dragons and Seath since Dark Souls 1, but that doesn't explain how he's alive. Well, Havel had a band of knights who followed him and more than likely wore the same armor as he did, so I don't think this is Havel, more just a knight of Havel. But while this is explained fairly easily, Ornstein is not. Ornstein has always had a complicated history within the series, as he was clearly present in Dark Souls 1, but then shows up again in Dark Souls 2 as the old Dragon Slayer, and then again in this game as the Dragon Slayer armor and in Archdragon Peak where we are now. Firstly, I've always been a firm believer in the fact that we kill Ornstein in Dark Souls 1. The old Dragon Slayer is simply someone who is trying to uphold Ornstein's legacy or is somehow connected to Ornstein's soul, since we know from Dark Souls 2 that the old Lord Souls can inhibit others' bodies, so it's possible Ornstein's soul inhibited someone wearing his armor. It's also possible that the soul felt comfortable with this decision, given Ornstein's armor is pretty synonymous with his legacy. As for Dark Souls 3, we know that the Dragon Slayer armor is not Ornstein, it is simply just another Dragon Slayer, as the weapon and armor are completely different. But Archdragon Peak is unique. This is not only the same armor that Ornstein wore, but its item description talks about how he left the Anor Londo Cathedral to come here, but when did this happen? He couldn't have came here and then went back to the cathedral as his armor is located here, and he couldn't have left after Dark Souls 1 because he died. So the only real explanation that makes any plausible sense is that Ornstein dies in Dark Souls 1. He then has his soul return like the previous Lord Soul wears, but decides to inhabit someone wearing his armor, or maybe even the armor itself, as it's familiar to the soul. We talked about in Dark Souls 2 how it seemed like the four Great Ones were connected to specific Lord Souls because of their feelings and emotions. We still don't know whether or not these Lord Souls connected with them because of these similar emotions, or or if they gain these feelings from consuming the souls, but if this is true, then it would make sense that Ornstein is continuing to fight the same and has the same goals and ambitions across all the games. Regardless of how Ornstein is alive or how he even ended up here in the first place, we at least know why he was here, and that was because of the Nameless King. The Nameless King has actually been teased since Dark Souls 1, as he was the infamous firstborn son of Gwyn that was referenced in various items in that game. From both 1 and 3, we can piece together that the Nameless King is the firstborn son of Gwyn and was a dragon slayer during the war with the everlasting dragons. But at some point, he would eventually cast all this away and ally himself with the dragons, and if you want to talk about presentation when it comes to boss fights, this one needs to be mentioned. Not only does the introduction of the boss feel intense as the Nameless King swoops in on a Storm Drake, but when we finish the Drake off, he literally kills it and takes the power for himself. From just a pure gameplay perspective, he's easily the second best fight in the game. There's a feeling that occurs across the entire series when everything comes together. You've learned the moveset, understood the timings, and discovered the punishes. All that's required is to put it together. And when that clicks, it becomes one of the best fights in the game. His moves are punishing, have delays, and are even mixed together, as one combo might have 2 swings, but the next will be 3, or it will do away with the 3rd swing and add a completely different move. The fight requires complete concentration and the ability to be patient. Dodging too early will more often than not lead to your death, so you have to be on high alert for the whole fight. Genuinely a great fight from top to bottom, with it only being surpassed by one being we have yet to cover. But before we move on to the DLC, I want to look back at the game so far. Dark Souls 3 set out to create a dying world that features places that have been ridden with disease and death, showing to the player that their inability to let go of what they know and continue this Age of Fire will only make things worse. Even a basic understanding of the lore will convey this, as you can see just how bad everything has gotten, from the fact that there's hundreds of dead bodies littered throughout each level, and people are becoming corrupted and infected with these diseases and plagues, causing them to either go hollow or turn into a massive black sludge. The demon race, a group of beings thought to be on top, are dying out, the gods have all been wiped out, and the Lords of Cinder, beings who have the ability to rule over anything they please due to their power, refuse to continue this Age of Fire. Aldrich wants to continue his own age, so admittedly that is a bit more selfish, but the other 3 have recognized that their sacrifice did or will amount to nothing. Linking the Flame never stopped the Abyss, it never stopped the Profane Flame, and it's never going to end the suffering that's occurred since Lordran. So if the first flame is supposed to be this symbol of peace and comfort, then what is actually so good about it? All of this has been illustrated to us throughout the story and is a testament to how genius the writing of Dark Souls 3 truly is. But now it's time to move on. Not just to a new age, as that will come later, but to a new world. A painted world, even. This old man in front of us is Gale, and he's how we start the DLC, Ashes of Ariandel. We talked about this place briefly when we discussed Pontiff Sullivan, and said it was a painted world for those without purpose. Upon entering, we're greeted by a deformed being who welcomes us and tells us to get comfortable on a bed of rot. Similar to the real world, the painted worlds have their own cycle, and it's this cycle that is so interesting, as in the main game, the Age of Fire is being constantly prolonged, and it's the Age of Dark that will take it over. But as we'll soon see, it's the rot that's being prolonged, and the only way to get rid of it is to burn it. The painted world of Ariandel is just a similar version of the Dark Souls universe with the same themes and ideas, just twisted around. They're both separate worlds with separate cycles, and each one has a particular cycle that is going on too long, and it's either the fire that's causing it or the fire that will get rid of it. This is also the reason Gale sends us to the painted world in the first place. As opposed to the Corvian we meet first, who tells us to embrace the rot, Gale and even this Corvian settler want us to set it aflame. Setting the painting aflame will allow a new painted world to be created, but they can't do that without fire, and the person preventing this is Sister Fried. She is the reason the rot is being prolonged, and she's also the other ash that the Gale and the Corvian refer to, meaning she's unkindled. It's because of her decision to keep the rot going that has caused much of the destruction of this place. Interestingly though, only the Corvians seem to care. As we talked about, the painted world is for those without purpose, and the Corvians aren't the only ones who reside here, as these soldiers are the members of the Undead Legion of Farron. In the beginning of the video, when we talked about the Abyss Watchers, I mentioned that when they linked the flame, the rest of the Legion left. Once that occurred, the others no longer had a purpose, and further lost any chance of having one once they came to the realization that their home had turned into a swamp. According to their armor, these Farron followers seem to be specifically tasked with killing any undead legion who succumbed to the Abyss, which makes me wonder how the Abyss Watchers cutscene would have played out had the assassins not left. Maybe the Abyss Watchers would have finally been able to regain their strength again now that they didn't have to kill each other. The other group of people are the Millwood Knights. They don't have too much lore and anything to really tie any of the characters or events to them, but at some point in time they lost their forest that they called home and then sought refuge in the Painted World. These groups seem to just carry on throughout their day and simply exist within the painted world, but the Corvians are different, as you have the regular looking settlers who want to burn the rot away, but then there's also the Corvian Knights who were so infatuated with Sister Fried that they've now turned against their brethren. Just the basic idea of what the painted world represents to the people within it is such an intriguing concept, but the way this loosely connects to the main game's themes is genius. One thing I always found disappointing though about Ashes of Ariandel was the length. Once we enter the painting, we're to meet with Sister Fried, who welcomes us but just as quickly dismisses our arrival and tells us to leave because we no longer belong here. I have no issue with this as it's not holding the player's hand, but everything just feels like it's going so fast as right after this we're to find the painter, enter the basement of Sister Fried's church, activate a lever, and then we're already at the final boss. Everything just feels so fast, and I was surprised how quickly the final boss was introduced to me. I've talked about before how most of the Souls games DLCs are like this and don't take much time overall. This of course though largely depends on how fast you beat the bosses, as they're usually the main hurdles. But Ashes of Ariandel felt shorter than normal. There is an optional boss that could take up more of your time, but this was just so that the player could access the PvP matches, and the lore of the boss also connects to this, as this was the champion of the undead matches that the undead used to partake in. Other than that, it's pretty much just going from one area to the next, and the distance between them is quite short. Once we do finish talking with Sister Frieda though, our path will eventually lead us to the Corvian settlements, and its church where we will meet with Sir Wilhelm. He was the guard that was outside the church where Sister Fried was located. But what's more interesting though about Sir Wilhelm is that he not only has a black flame buff on his weapon, but he also wields the Dark Hand, both of which have ties to the Abyss. This relates back to Sister Frieda, as she was one of the 3 sisters of the Sable Church. Her other sisters were Liliane and Yuria, which means she has ties to Londor, and this is reinforced by the different dialogue options that we get from her if we have the Dark Sigils in our inventory from Yuria's questline. It's not much, but she does recognize us as the Lord of Hollows. Given that she is unkindled, it's possible that she tried to link the flame or usurp it, and this possibly got her exiled from the church. Without a purpose or home, she may have been drawn to the Painted World, which is how she ended up here in the first place, and figured that she could rule over this land by herself. However, given that we have this innate ability to ruin people's plans, we're going to prevent Sister Fried from doing so. To do this, we need to talk to the painter and unlock the doors leading to her room. For her to be able to paint though, she will need to see flame, and to do this, we need to get to the source.
I see flame. Flame flickering once again. Not enough blood yet shed. My flail. Bring me my flail.
This is Father Ariandel, the painter of the Painted World of Ariandel, who is now being held captive by Sister Frieda. She managed to convince Father Ariandel that the only way to preserve the Painted World was to bury the flame and let the rock consume the world. To stop it from spreading, he uses his flail on himself, causing him to bleed, which appeases the flame. It's quite a sad story, and it makes Sister Frieda out to be even worse of a person than she already was. Given that we're going against her wishes though, she fights us, and she is very difficult, which is also very entertaining. I love this fight, and I think it's a great way to end the DLC. The fight starts out quite normal until her blood reaches Father Ariandel, who freaks out, causing the room to be engulfed in flames, and him to break out of his restraints and attack us. Frieda's also back, and it turns into a 2v1. It's very reminiscent of Ornstein and Smo, as the duo complements each other quite well. This is also the only fight in the trilogy to my knowledge where you can summon an NPC in the middle of the fight, as Gale can only be summoned for the second phase. It also makes sense to bring him along since both you and him have the same objective, so there's no reason for him not to help you. After Sister Frieda has been dealt with though, we can return to the Yeah, so if it wasn't already bad enough, Sister Frieda has a third phase. This whole encounter is extremely stressful, as you not only have to plan for 1 but 2 extra phases. There's been so many times where I got pummeled during this fight in the first phase that I just reset, as I knew it wasn't worth starting the next phase with half the Estus. She really forces the player to learn her moveset. Thankfully though, Gale does make the encounter easier, but it's still very difficult even with his assistance. With Sister Fried and Father Ariandel dead for real this time, the fire will now be able to consume the painting without any delays, which means the painter can now work on the new world she plans to create. A cold, dark, and very gentle place, as she calls it. She's going to need paint to make that painting, and from what we learn from Father Ariandel's soul, we know that the paintings are written in blood. So Gale's objective will be to scour the land for some blood to use as pigment, and while he does that, we can go on to the next DLC, but Gale's here too. He has written messages for us and points us towards where we're supposed to go, so what blood is he getting? Well, Gale is trying to find the blood of the Dark Soul, which leads him to the Ring City. Ashes of Ariandel was a short but decent DLC. The bosses were great, and the actual design of Ariandel was beautiful, from its frozen tundras to its rotted swamps, but if it felt complete, or if the DLC suddenly ended so soon, that's the point, as both of Dark Souls 3's DLCs are a connected story. the story of Gale and the Painter and their quest to create a new world, which leads us to the Ring City. The start of the Ring City DLC sees us travel to the Dreg Heap, the area we talked about earlier in the video. As I said then, time is getting worse as the world progresses, and this is a perfect example, as now that the Age of Fire is getting even closer to the end, lands are converging on each other more and more, and the world is practically collapsing in on itself. Here in the Dreg Heap, we can see nostalgic callbacks to the past, like the Earthen Peak Windmill and the Desert Pyromancer from Dark Souls 2. This is a very long and convoluted level to really showcase how bad everything has gotten, but at the very end of the level is the Demon Duo. Not only is the gameplay of this fight fantastic, as it not only surpasses the previous duo, but might even be on par as Ornstein and Smo, but the location of the fight is heavily theorized to be the original Firelink Shrine of Dark Souls 1. The reason being is that the exit of this arena is the same structure that Frampt appears in. Gale can once again join you for this fight, but it will trivialize this encounter tremendously, as the demons have long cooldowns between their attacks and also alternate movesets. I actually found this fight to be balanced while being outnumbered, so adding more people makes it worse. Once the demons are both dead, the last one to die gets to be reborn as the Demon Prince. Just like the first flame, the Chaos Flame needed to be rekindled by a demon with vast power, and the current Demon Prince at the time was going to, but ended up facing Lorien and was defeated. However, all demons share memories with another, so in theory that means they can share the power of the Demon Prince, and when the last demon falls, it is reborn as the Demon Prince and the last of its kind. The Demon Prince is a genuinely great fight, and for it being the first boss in the DLC, this is already a great start to the additional content. When the Demon Prince does fall though, we can finally say goodbye to the demons. The once great race thought to be almost on top has now withered away, never to be remembered again, just like everything else in this world. With the Dreg Heap finished, we can move on to the final location of the DLC, but one thing that's been very interesting about the Dreg Heap is the progression of time. As we go further down in the game, we're actually going further back in the past. As we start out at the very top in Dark Souls 3, we move further down to Dark Souls 2 with the Earthen Peak making an appearance, and then we're all the way at the bottom where we're back in Dark Souls 1 with the Firelink Shrine. But we can go even further back, as past the old Firelink Shrine, we can travel to the Ring City, a place that has existed since the gods toppled the dragons. The Ring City is gorgeous, and is one of the most beautiful locations in the Dark Souls trilogy. This place is home to the Pygmy Lords, and they have a wonderful welcoming committee. Oddly enough though, these Shadow Archers actually look like the Ruined Sentinels from Dark Souls 2. According to their armor set, they were a band of knights who were sent to the Ring City, so it's possible that Vendrick may have sent them here as a way to find out more about the undead curse, but were defeated and now are used by the city to defend its people. The Ring City is the home of the Pygmies, the ancestors of mankind. We don't hear much regarding the actual furtive pygmy, but the Ring City is ruled by the Pygmy Lords, the early descendants of the original pygmy. According to various item descriptions, though, Gwyn gave them this city as a reward for their help against the dragons, but since this is located at the literal edge of the world, it's possible Gwyn wanted the pygmies out of sight and away from his kingdom since they had the Dark Soul, which of course he does not like. As for how the pygmies helped during the war, well, we can find out soon after, as these ringed knights were some of the soldiers who fought during the war with the everlasting dragons. The weapons they carry were forged from the Abyss, since that was the birthplace of humanity, which would explain the blatant dark sign on their chest, as it seems that they too were cursed like we were by Gwyn. If we progress further into the level, we'll end up in this abyssal swamp and end up fighting the Dragon Slayer armor again, and if we read its description, we'll discover that when we defeated it in Lothric, it somehow made its way down here and then became possessed again by the feeling of battle. Look, I love Ornstein as much as the next guy, but we do not have to keep bringing him back. We can just let his legacy die. I understand in this case it is just a piece of armor and not actually Ornstein, but you have to admit that this boss's design is purposely similar to Ornstein's. I found this encounter more annoying rather than interesting, as there was zero reason to bring back the Dragon Slayer armor again. In this swamp we can also find a white-faced locust similar to the one earlier in the level. These locusts are beings from the Abyss, and they were supposed to preach sermons to men so that they could draw them towards the dark, but they couldn't see past their stomachs and cared more about what they were eating, which is why they act like gluttonous monsters. This description means that this is what they always looked like and didn't turn into these creatures at some point, but it may also imply that they were born alongside humanity within the Abyss. Each of them ends up talking about specific people and are possibly referencing certain NPCs.
And so, she lived in fear of the dark, of the things that gnawed at her flesh.
The little creatures that nibble at me in the darkness.
And so, despite his weighty armor, he lived in fear of a delicate thing, little more than a girl. Where fire resideth, shadows twist and shrivel, but in the abyss there are shadows none. Fear not the dark, my friend, and let the feast begin.
I've always found this interaction odd, as it's unclear how this creature even knows anything about these NPCs. This has caused a bit of debate amongst many people in the community, as some claim that it's showing how destructive humanity is. But on the other hand, like with the case of Irina's dialogue, the Locust Preacher could be implying that the Abyss is not as bad as it seems, as that preconceived idea Irina had of the Abyss caused her to feel these insect-like creatures in her head. I don't really think that there is a correct answer here, as it sort of ties into the world of Dark Souls and how the player views the Abyss, humanity, and the Age of Dark, and whether or not it's something that they should be embracing, similar to how we have to make a choice at the end of the games. Before we leave though, we can view this Purging Monument, which is only accessible to humans, as to even get to this area we need to transform into a humanity sprite using a white tree branch. This monument may be the source of all the Purging Stones. Purging Stones have existed since Dark Souls 1 and were used to remove the curse effect in that game, but it's not about taking the curse and removing it, it's just transferring it to the stone itself to be the new host, but the stone is said to once be a person. So maybe these are the beings who were turned into stone, or what they became once we transfer the curse to the stone, or maybe it's something else entirely. After getting out of the swamp, we'll find a dragon named Midir. This isn't fake like the ancient dragon. Midir is an actual descendant of the Ark dragons from long ago. Even though he only seems to make an appearance here, if we knock him off the bridge and find a secret tunnel, we can find him again. He is easily the most difficult boss in the entire game with a staggering 15,000 health, and he's also equipped with some moves that might one-shot the player depending on their equipment. According to his boss soul, Midir was actually raised by the gods and was tasked with fighting the Abyss, and it seems that he's been alive for a long time, as one description says from not long after the beginning, meaning he may have existed before even fire was born, back when the dragons ruled the world. The reason he's going so crazy is very similar to Artorias, as the Abyss has fully corrupted him, so we need to put him out of his misery. He is definitely the ultimate challenge for players given his kit of high damaging moves, but assuming you can conquer him, you'll receive the Spears of the Church, which ties into our next boss, Half-Light. Half-Light is a member of the Covenant Spears of the Church who guards Filianor, who is said to be Gwyn's daughter, who he left here in the Ring City. But Half-Light is a PvP boss, as there's a chance a real player can replace Half-Light and be the boss instead. But that is only accessible to those who defeat Midir, since he drops the pendant that allows you to access the Covenant. Sadly though, since this game is over 6 years old, you'll more than likely just get Half-Light instead. Interestingly though, Half-Light may have been from Ulasil, as the bow he uses says that it was a relic from an ancient land of sorceries that has been swallowed by the Abyss. And we know that Ulasil has many unique spells like Repair, Hidden Body, and Chameleon. His outfit also states that a group of young missionaries went to the Ring City long ago, but Half-Light stayed behind, making him the final spear of the Church. This would also mean that there was a time in Ulasil's history when it wasn't corrupted by the Abyss and was a normal land before Koth came and tricked them. Behind the church is Filianor, the girl they swore to protect, and she may have one of the best cutscenes this series has to offer. Upon touching her egg, she wakes up, which sees the world change. Out of everything in the Dark Souls series, this might be at the top as the most talked about interaction in the game, as there's so much that happens with very little explanation as to what it means. Many people believe that Filianor and her egg held up the illusion of the Ring City, similar to Gwendolyn and Anne Orlando in Dark Souls 1. But some have also claimed that this takes us to the future and is a glimpse of what the world will look like should we keep things going. Her egg though is interesting, as it has a very dark center, and if we relate this back to the repair spell from earlier that says light is time, by breaking the egg we break the dark inside of it, which allows light to appear, meaning now time exists and is no longer stagnant, which would go along with the theory that this is a future, as the time accelerates after being stagnant for so long. Regardless of what you believe in though, this cutscene is great and allows us to access the Wasteland of Ash. Inside this wasteland is two beings, and if you subscribe to the theory that this is the future, this might be the last two beings left in the world, us and Gale.
What? Still here? Hand it over, that thing, your dark soul.
Gale has not only gone mad and grown in size, but he is the final boss of the DLC. The Ring City was the final DLC, and also the final piece of content in the Dark Souls trilogy. Having played this game on release, I had already beaten the final boss tons of times, so for me, Gale was technically my final boss of Dark Souls, and I couldn't have asked for anything better. To me, Gale is the best boss in the game and even the entire trilogy. Everything from design to presentation to gameplay is completely perfect. Gale is a slave knight, who are knights that were used as fodder in many of the land's bleakest wars, but it seems most of them went hollow, all except for Gale. Gale came to the Ring City in search of the Dark Souls, and thus slaughtered the Pygmy lords as they contain the Dark Souls within them, since they're the descendants of the furtive Pygmy. But Gale realized that the Dark Souls had dried up, so in order to make them liquid enough to be used as pigment, he consumed the Dark Souls that they carried. Since it was now in his bloodstream, it was able to mix into a liquid again, but doing so made him go mad. Gale literally has the power of the Dark Soul within his body, and uses the power of the Dark Soul and the Abyss to fight us, as evident by these red skulls that appear from his cape. He and Gwyn also contrast each other in this respect. Gwyn was a being who was a god from the beginning and on top of the food chain, and is remembered by all for his sacrifice. But Gale was a slave, the lowest of the low, whose sacrifice will be known by only us, a lowly piece of unkindled ash. This sacrifice of Gale's ties into a theory of mine. After his death, we can take the blood of the Dark Soul to the painter to be used as pigment for her new world. Gale knew he wouldn't make it back, but continued his mission anyway by handing it off to us. He helps us defeat Sister Frida and the Demon Prince, which are the two required bosses we need to beat to get to the Ring City, and once we do get to the Ring City, he leaves markings of his cape along the way that it will eventually point us towards his location. He wanted us to find him, and he wanted us to defeat him so that we can continue his mission for him and give the painter the blood she needed. As a whole, Gale is easily my favorite character and boss in this game. He is, like us, a nobody. He isn't some godlike figure or a being who was born with insurmountable power. He, like us, gained this power through battle, and now the two strongest beings in the world are duking it out at the edge of the world. Truly the best boss this game has to offer, and was the best way to end all the DLCs. With Gale defeated, we can now give the painter the pigment. She thanks us and will eventually start painting. She never actually finishes the painting though, and this is an important detail. Just like the other DLCs in the trilogy, this isn't the end of the game. The final boss is at the kiln, it's not Gale. So giving her this pigment doesn't mean the end of the game, it's just one part of our long journey, even if it seems like a wonderful conclusion to the game. The DLCs of Dark Souls are the best in the series, and the Ring City is a big reason why. Ash's Averiandel is great, and a nice additional side story, especially since we get to learn more about the painted worlds, but the callbacks, references, and answers to questions we've been wondering about for years are what makes this DLC so impressive. Furthermore, both DLCs have some of the most intense fights in the game and are the pinnacle of this game's combat. From Software has always made their DLCs with incredible quality, and sometimes are even better than the main game, and Dark Souls 3 continues to honor this tradition. Gale's objective is now complete, so now it's time to complete ours, which is go to the kiln and determine the fate of the world once again. Defending this kiln is a being known as the Soul of Cinder. This is the physical manifestation of every being to link the flame since its inception, meaning our characters from Dark Souls 1 and 2 are a part of this being. He also fights like a real player too, as his moveset is by far the most diverse in the game. He has 3 different melee weapons, uses all the schools of magic, and even has the ninja flip ring from Dark Souls 1. But our old characters aren't the only ones in this being. There is one other character we know of, the one who was here from the very beginning. He was the one that created this world, so it's ironic that he gets to be here for when we destroy it. The Soul of Cinder not only has the same moveset as Gwyn, but also the same piano and its theme music. I'll be honest, I get a bit emotional whenever I hear this. Hearing that piano made me think of the journey I had taken to get here, all the defeats and victories, all the NPCs I had encountered, all the kingdoms I uncovered, and all the fates of the people I've met along the way. We have seen the literal rise and fall of the entire world before our eyes, and every single person and decision we have made has shaped us into the person we are now, a person who now has to determine the entire fate of the world. Should you go against everything this game has taught you, and still believe in the First Flame, you'll be shown a very depressing ending. The Ashen One links the flame and continues the Age of Fire. but it's not the spectacle we saw in Dark Souls 1. It can barely even cover our character, let alone the rest of the arena. The Ashen one looks disappointed, as if they expected something more. In fact, we the player were probably expecting something more, and are now just as disappointed. This is why I believe that everyone from Gwyn till now has linked the flame when it faded, as if the world alternated like it was supposed to, then this wouldn't make sense as to why the flame is this pitiful. The first flame is on its deathbed, and we still haven't granted it the death it wants. If we instead summon the Firekeeper, she will take the first flame and extinguish it for good. The Age of Dark will commence, and the world has gone completely black. And while it may seem scary to venture into a world without fire, the Firekeeper assures us that the fire will eventually return someday, just like it did all those years ago. Remember, things are meant to live and die. The Age of Dark is temporary, and fire will return, and an Age of Fire will begin again. But hopefully, it will not be extended this time. If you're feeling greedy, you can also enact the Age of Dark and take the flame's power for yourself. This is similar to our final ending and the secret ending of Dark Souls 3, the Usurpation of Fire. This requires us to complete Yuria's questline. Yuria is from a place called Londor, and we know that she's also the sister of Frida and Liliane, who created the Sable Church in Londor. But what is Londor? Well, it's a land of hollows, as we can see all the hollows bowing down to us as the new Lord of Hollows. Londor also had many pilgrims that came to this land, possibly to find the first flame and overtake Lothric. Those butterflies from the Dragon Slayer armor are called pilgrim butterflies, so maybe this is the pilgrim's final form, so to speak. These pilgrims are most likely members of the Sable Church, as while the sisters created the church, the pilgrims most likely went here to worship their god, who happens to be the primordial serpent Koth. We never see Koth in-game, and the only reason we even know this is because of Yuria's death dialogue, but the callback to him was insane, and almost made me nervous for a bit, as he could have been orchestrating this church for who knows how long so that he finally gets what he wants. If you remember, he tricked the four kings and the people of Ulusil into being engulfed by the Abyss, so what's stopping him from doing it again to the people of Londor? Although, in his defense, when we placed the Lord Vessel in Dark Souls 1, Koth says that every last one of them failed him, so maybe he isn't trying to screw with Londor and possibly found a genuine group of people that will follow and carry out his wish. Accompanying us into the new world is also Henri of Astora, who, depending on our actions, either got to defeat Aldrich with us and finally be able to kill the person she hated the most, or gets killed and unwillingly serves as our bride when we become the Lord of Hollows, which is quite a dark twist. Londor also seems to embrace its hollow state, but this may come at a cost. Yol of Londor can give us the dark sigils required to progress the questline, but once he does that, he dies. And the assassin who gives us the wedding sword dies after the ceremony, so it seems like they're only able to retain their sanity when hollow, but as a consequence die once their purpose has been fulfilled. This is just about all we know in regards to Londor, but there are still quite a few theories involved with the kingdom, such as the fact that Londor could be tied to Drang Lake or Velka. Admittedly, it's a small connection, but items from Dark Souls 1 and 2, like the Vow of Silence, Dead Again, Dark Drift, and Dark Hand, have had their item descriptions changed. Vow of Silence in Dark Souls 1 is a spell that was created by Velka, but in Dark Souls 3, it's used by members of the church. And the Dark Drift from Dark Souls 2 was said to be used by the Grave Warden in the Undead Crypt, but in Dark Souls 3, it's used by Yuria. However, I don't think Vendrick and Aldia are related to this though, as the two of them wanted to remove the curse, and Londor wants to embrace their hollow form. Although, in a manner of speaking, the hollow form is the true version of man, and thus could be, in a way, what the brothers desired, but I'm not too sure I believe in this theory. Especially given how the brothers are never mentioned in this game, and would be weird if they finally made an appearance now. Regardless, now it's time to say goodbye to the Age of Fire and to Dark Souls. The Age of Dark is a metaphor for the Dark Souls series. Every Dark Souls game has taken place in the Age of Fire, and by keeping this age going, we can keep the Dark Souls games going, but is that really what we want? Many games have gone on to make numerous sequels, and ruin the integrity of that series. The Age of Dark is not just about moving on from the Age of Fire, but from Dark Souls itself. As much as I want more Dark Souls games to keep coming, it's only going to ruin the franchise going forward. But that doesn't mean we have to say goodbye to the Souls genre. We have Elden Ring and any other Souls games that come after it, so our hunger for this genre of games will never die, but we do need to say goodbye to Dark Souls. Having Dark Souls end now means it ends on a high note, and I'd rather see the game quit while it's ahead than watch it release sequel after sequel that will inevitably tarnish its reputation, causing it to be one of the many games in the industry that ran itself into the dirt. So, it's time to finally put this game and its world to rest. Thank you for watching.